There are moments in history when the world seems to hold its breath, moments when a force rises from a place so distant, so unlikely, that the great civilizations of its age never imagined it could reach them. Yet it does. And when it arrives, nothing remains the same. This is the story of such a force. Long before maps were inked with borders, long before empires of stone believed themselves unshakable, there stretched a wild and endless land, an ocean of grass rolling beneath a boundless sky. A place where winter cut like iron, where hunger shaped the rhythm of life, and where survival demanded not comfort but cunning. From the windswept steppes of Mongolia came riders who would redraw the fate of continents. Men hardened by cold and silence, guided by instincts older than kingdoms, and bound to horses that carried them farther and faster than any army the world had ever seen. Their rise was not a miracle. It was the result of discipline, of brutal necessity, and of a leader forged in betrayal and exile. A man who learned early that the earth offers mercy to no one, and so he offered none in return. Under his banner, the tribes of the steppe once scattered, and feuding became a single blade. And with that blade, they carved a path across Asia, the Middle East, and deep into the heart of Europe. But this is not merely a tale of destruction. It is a chronicle of transformation. For where the Mongols passed, worlds collided. Merchants, envoys, scholars, engineers, monks, and wanderers moved across a network of routes protected with a precision unmatched in the medieval age. Ideas traveled as swiftly as armies. Faiths mingled. Technologies crossed deserts and mountain chains. A vast empire born in violence became, for a time, a corridor of connection. Tonight, you will follow that story from its first lonely sparks on the steppe to the moment its fires lit half the known world. You will travel with armies that moved like storms, witness cities rise and fall, and walk through the fragile peace that followed in their wake. And as we reach the final chapters, you will see how even the mightiest empires carry within themselves the seeds of their decline. If you find yourself drawn into this journey, into the wind, the dust, the iron, and the history woven through every mile, remember to like, share, and subscribe. For there are many more stories waiting in the shadows of the past, and this is only the beginning. Before empires rose in stone and marble, before the courts of Europe argued over crowns and succession, there existed a world carved not by kings but by wind, a world without walls, where distance itself was the first and most merciless ruler. It stretched across the heart of Asia, vast, unbroken, and ancient. Here, in the eternal steppe, the horizon was the only boundary, and the sky hung so close to the earth that every storm felt like the breath of something older than time. Dawn arrived reluctantly over this land. It did not blaze up with warmth or color. Instead, it crept across the plains in a thin, cold glow, brushing the frost that clung to the tips of wild grass. The steppe breathed in silence, waiting. A stillness so total that even the distant mountains, ragged silhouettes against the pale morning, seemed to hold themselves motionless. And then, as if stirred by some invisible command, the wind began to rise. It swept across the grasslands in long, rolling waves, bending each blade as though the earth itself were bowing. The wind carried everything with it: the scent of snow from the northern plateaus, the sharp dryness of old fires, the musk of herds moving in the distance. It was the pulse of this place shaping the land and the lives dependent upon it. On the steppe, nothing resisted the wind for long. Even people learned to move with it, not against it. Scattered across these plains were clusters of round felt tents, gears rooted lightly to the earth by nothing more than wooden frames and rope. They were not homes in the permanent sense known to settled civilizations. They were shelters designed to be raised in an hour, dismantled in half that time, and carried to wherever grass and water demanded. To live here was to chase the shifting line between survival and hunger year after year, generation after generation. In the first light, herds of horses began to stir. Their silhouettes emerged through the drifting mist, manes stiff with cold. These animals were smaller than the war horses of Europe, yet far tougher creatures, bred by nature for endurance rather than spectacle. They learned early to scrape through snow, for grass, to stand firm against gales, to travel mile after mile without faltering. For the people of the steppe, a horse was not a possession. It was an extension of the self, a companion bound to every journey, every raid, every choice that meant life instead of death. The steppe people moved with their herds following the seasons as faithfully as birds in migration. Winter forced them into valleys and sheltered basins where they huddled against the icy breath sweeping from Siberia. Summer drew them upward into green pastures near the foothills where streams melted into rushing ribbons of silver. They never stayed long in one place. The land allowed no such luxury. Grass exhausted quickly beneath too many hooves. Water vanished without warning. To remain was to weaken. To move was to survive. This rhythm, ancient and unchanging, shaped the character of those born into it. From childhood, they learned that hesitation carried a price. A delayed decision could cost a herd. A misjudged path could doom an entire clan. The world here rewarded speed, discipline, and awareness. It also rewarded silence, for the steppe taught its lessons without ceremony. No priests interpreted its meaning. No walls softened its judgment. One learned by enduring. To outsiders, this land may have seemed barren, but to those who knew it, it was a living force. Every ridge, every stream bed, every shift of wind revealed something essential. A darkening horizon warned of storms that could strip flesh from bone. A trail of churned earth signaled the presence of wandering clans or rival tribes. A sudden stillness could mean wolves nearby or worse, raiders. Danger was constant, but so was opportunity. This was a world where individuals rose not through inheritance, but through skill, courage, and the loyalty they could command. Among the clans, life held no promise of comfort. Food was earned through unending labor. Meat came from the hunt or the herd. Milk curd and fermented mare's drink sustained families through the long winters. Children learned to ride before they could walk firmly. A young boy might be lifting a bow while still small enough to be carried in one arm. A young girl might be training to keep a fire alive through nights of wind so fierce it rattled every stone. Every member of the camp, regardless of age or standing, contributed to the fragile structure of survival. Yet there was beauty here, harsh, unadorned, and absolute. At dusk, the sky opened into vast fields of burning gold-purple and ember-red, blending together in a quiet spectacle unmatched by any palace lantern. At night, the heavens filled with stars so clear they looked close enough to touch. Travelers found themselves surrounded not by darkness, but by a luminous tapestry guiding them across miles of silent grass. No cathedral ceiling ever held such immensity, and no walled city ever offered such freedom. But freedom came with a cost. The clans of the steppe were notoriously independent, bound by kinship, but divided by ambition. Rivalries could last decades. Blood feuds could outlive the men who began them. A disputed pasture, a stolen herd, an insult delivered at a gathering, any of these could ignite conflict. When they fought, they did so with a precision and fluidity foreign to their settled neighbors. Battles were sudden, mobile, and unforgiving. A quick strike, a cloud of arrows, a retreat designed to lure pursuers into open ground. These were the tactics passed down like sacred knowledge. In such a world, leadership emerged from necessity. A man who could not protect his people lost them. A man who could not feed his family saw them taken in by another clan. Authority was not granted by birth alone. It had to be proven again and again in judgment, in combat, in the loyalty one inspired. This land, shaped only by wind hunger and motion, shaped its people the same way. It stripped away softness. It demanded resilience. It forged individuals capable of traversing impossible distances, launching swift raids, and adapting to landscapes that would cripple armies from more prosperous regions. And though no one yet knew it, the steppe was preparing something extraordinary. Across these plains and tents, scattered like islands in an ocean of grass, a culture was gathering, the traits that would one day shake the foundations of the world. Discipline, unity in the face of hardship, unmatched horsemanship, and a fierce understanding that survival belonged only to those who seized it with unyielding resolve. The wind moved again, sweeping over the frozen grass. It carried with it the faint echoes of hooves, the promise of storms yet to come, and the first quiet murmurs of a destiny that would rise from these plains and thunder outward toward every corner of the known earth. As the sun arched higher above the steppe, its light sharpened the contours of the land. What seemed at dawn like a quiet, pale world now revealed its hidden textures, long scars where ancient rivers once ran, narrow gullies carved by spring meltwater, and scattered clusters of sagebrush clinging stubbornly to dry soil. The steppe was not empty. It only demanded patience to understand. Across this immensity, life unfolded in patterns both delicate and severe. Herds drifted like slow-moving clouds. Sheep, goats, cattle, camels, each group tended by riders who watched the horizon more than they watched the animals themselves. From any direction, a dust plume might rise, a visiting clan, a band of hunters, or something far more dangerous. Vigilance was a constant companion. Every clan lived aware that it was alone, yet not alone. Remote, yet always within reach of rivals who might covet a herd or a stretch of pasture. These people had no walls, but their mobility was a fortress of its own. A fully loaded gyr could be collapsed in minutes, its poles and felt stowed on carts pulled by oxen. Mothers moved briskly, tying bundles, securing ropes, lifting small children onto saddles. Men rode ahead, studying the landscape for fresh grass and safe water. When the camp finally stretched into motion, it looked less like a migration and more like a living convoy. Hooves pounding softly across the earth, livestock dust drifting beneath the brightening sky. Children grew into this life without questioning it. The steppe raised them with the same discipline it granted their parents. A toddler clung to a saddle as easily as another child might cling to a stairway railing. A young boy, hardly taller than the bow he carried, practiced shooting from horseback, learning to keep his balance while the ground rushed beneath him. A young girl learned to track weather shifts by reading the faintest line of shadow across the western sky. Every task required alertness. Every mistake carried a memory that might shape the next decision. With time, these small lessons gathered into something larger. By the age of 12, a child of the steppe possessed a familiarity with horses that outsiders could scarcely comprehend. They rode not as separate beings, but as two halves of a single instinct. Their bodies learned to anticipate the motion of the animal, the brief jump before a gallop, the tightening of muscle, before a sudden turn, the tremor that signaled danger, sensed before it was seen. What to others appeared skill was simply life. Horses were the breath of the steppe. Herds of them roamed freely, untamed, vigilant, moving in arcs that became invisible maps only locals could read. Capturing, training, and caring for them was not merely work. It was the foundation of survival. A family without good horses was exposed. A clan with swift mounts could flee fight or pursue across distances that confounded the armies of settled kingdoms. To ride was to exist. The seasons dictated the rhythm of every movement. Spring provided brief abundance lambs, born in the softness of melting snows, fresh green grass along riverbeds, streams swollen with cold, fast water. Summer brought heat that shimmered across the plains and drove the herds toward higher ground. Autumn offered a narrow window of preparation. Meat-dried hides, tanned tools, repaired scouts sent to seek winter refuge. Winter itself arrived without mercy, a hammer of ice sweeping down from the Siberian taiga. Snowstorms buried entire valleys. Frozen winds sliced through felt coverings, forcing families to huddle close, feeding fires with every scrap of fuel they could gather before the world vanished into white haze. To survive these shifts, the people developed a resilience rooted in experience, not sentiment. Hardship was not a tragedy, it was a teacher. Hunger trained discipline. Cold trained endurance. Isolation trained self-reliance. There were no riches here, no granaries, no stone houses. Everything needed for survival had to be carried, hunted, or crafted. Even time itself felt different. Days were measured not by hours, but by the distance a horse could travel. Seasons were marked not by calendars, but by the movement of wind and animals. This upbringing forged habits ideal for war, long before these people ever conceived of empire. Every child learned to ride straight into the wind without complaint. Every adult maintained muscle memory that could draw a bowstring in a heartbeat. Hunters practiced stalking prey across miles of open land where cover was scarce, and a single misstep meant failure. Herding required the same skills as maneuvering and battle anticipation coordination and the ability to read the shifting patterns of movement across vast terrain. Even more important than skill was the mindset formed by this landscape. In settled kingdoms, authority often lived in palaces and was upheld by written laws and inherited rights. On the steppe, leadership existed only as long as it worked. A man who failed to protect his people lost their loyalty. A chief who demanded respect without offering security found himself abandoned. Decisions were made in the open beneath the sky, with the wind sweeping through gatherings of riders who valued strength, wisdom, and fairness over any title. Clans bonded through blood ties, shared hardship, and mutual dependency. In winter, they sometimes merged to survive. In summer, they might split to seek better grazing. Their alliances were flexible, shifting with need, opportunity, and fate. These connections forged a society both tightly knit and endlessly fluid, a structure unlike the rigid hierarchies of China, Persia, or Europe. Outsiders often mistook this flexibility for instability. But in truth, it created a culture capable of adapting at a speed that left its neighbors bewildered. Religion on the steppe reflected the natural world. The people looked to the sky not as a metaphor, but as a living presence. Tengri, the eternal blue heaven, was not worshipped like a distant deity, but acknowledged as the source of order governing all things. Beneath it, mountains, rivers, trees, and the spirits of ancestors shaped daily life. This worldview did not divide the sacred from the mundane. Everything was connected. Every action carried consequences that rippled across clans and generations. The spiritual and the practical blended seamlessly, guiding choices from migrations to hunts to conflict. Amid this landscape, the people of the steppe developed a sense of self bound to motion, struggle, and expectation. They knew the weight of responsibility early, understood hardship not as a burden, but as truth, and regarded the world beyond their plains with equal parts curiosity and caution. And though none of them could foresee the storms that would one day rise from among their own tents, the conditions that would shape those storms were already present. This land, so open, so brutal, so endlessly alive, was forging its children into instruments of astonishing capability. Their endurance, their unity in crisis, their mastery of horse and bow, their comfort with vast distances, and their keen instincts honed by a life lived under a boundless sky would soon give rise to something unprecedented in world history. For now, the steppe remained quiet beneath the turning light of day. But the wind was shifting again, brushing across tents and grazing herds, carrying with it a sense subtle, distant, but unmistakable, that the world beyond these horizons was not as immovable as it seemed. The steppe was preparing a people who would one day test the strength of distant kingdoms, challenge the certainties of ancient civilizations, and ride into legend on hooves that beat like drums across the earth. Before the world knew his name, before chronicles etched his deeds into the bones of history, there was only a boy walking alone along the spine of the steppe. His figure was small, barely more than a dark stroke against the pale grassland. Yet even in that quiet silhouette, there was something unyielding, something shaped not by privilege, but by loss. Temüjin came into the world with no prophecy draped over his cradle, only the whisper of hardship. Born to a lineage descended from warriors and wanderers, he opened his eyes to a life already marked by tension. His clan lived on the edge of shifting alliances, surrounded by rivals who measured strength not by words, but by the sharpness of resolve. Still, there was warmth in those early days, the comforting rhythm of hooves near the family tent, the murmured prayers his mother offered to the open sky, the confidence that his father's name, Hoelin's devotion, and the clan's unity would shelter him. That shelter vanished with tragic swiftness. The moment that transformed his childhood came on a windswept day when his father, Yesuge, never returned. The man had been poisoned during a visit to a rival tribe, felled not on a battlefield, but at a table shared in uneasy peace. When the news reached the family, the air inside the gyre thickened into something heavy and irreversible. Leadership dissolved, loyalty fractured. Without Yasuge's presence, the fragile alliances binding the family unraveled, leaving Temujin's household exposed. The abandonment came quietly, without confrontation, like a door closing in the night. One by one, warriors who once rode under Yasuge's banner turned away, driving their herds with them. They owed nothing, they believed, to a widow and her children. In a land where strength dictated survival, a family without a protector was not simply vulnerable, it was dismissed. Temujin still. Only a boy watched them ride off into the horizon, the hooves of their departing horses marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. His mother stood in silence beside him, the wind pulling at her sleeves as if trying to steady her. Behind them, the steppe stretched infinitely. Ahead of them lay a void. From that moment, childhood ended. Days became a struggle, fought against hunger and cold. The family lost their herds, their status, their security. They lived by scavenging roots near riverbanks, catching fish with crude traps, and gathering whatever scraps the land might yield. Temujin's shoulders bent beneath responsibilities far heavier than his age. His hands, calloused too early, learned to snare small animals, repair torn felt shape, crude tools from bone and wood. But hardship did not break him. It sharpened him. He grew attuned to the slightest changes in the landscape. The ripple of grass in approaching footsteps, the faint scent of weather shifting beyond the ridge, the thin trails of smoke that signaled nearby camps. He learned to trust silence as both shield and companion. Hunger taught him discipline. Isolation taught him observation. Every challenge etched another line of determination across his young mind. The boy also witnessed the fierce resilience of his mother, Hoelun. She became the anchor around which the siblings revolved, a woman who refused to collapse, even when the world narrowed into the tight circle of her fire. Her endurance created space for her children to survive, and in her quiet strength, Temujin absorbed a lesson that would shape his destiny. That loyalty, once earned, was a bond deeper than blood. Yet, for all the family solidarity, the world beyond remained dangerous. Rival groups still roamed nearby. Some watched the abandoned household with contempt, while others saw opportunity in its vulnerability. Tension simmered, waiting for the smallest spark. That spark came from within. As Temujin and his half-brother Bektar grew older, the resources the family relied on became increasingly scarce. Friction developed between the two youths, subtle at first, then unmistakable. It was more than the usual contest between siblings. In the harsh geometry of the steppe, food was a currency of survival, and Bektar began seizing more than his share. Each act of selfishness carved a deeper rift, one that threatened the fragile balance of the entire family. The conflict escalated in the solitude of the plains, where arguments held no witnesses, and justice demanded swiftness. In an act that would follow him throughout his life, Temujin confronted Bektar. The confrontation ended with a choice: no child should bear the decision to remove a threat from within, rather than expose the family to collapse. When the moment passed, the quiet afterward was heavier than any storm. This event did not harden him into cruelty. It carved into him an early brutal understanding of responsibility. Survival on the steppe demanded difficult decisions. Leadership was not a title, it was a burden accepted with consequences. In later years, when chroniclers tried to capture the essence of the man he became, they often pointed to this moment as the spark that ignited fate. But for the boy himself, it was simply another toll the world exacted. Seasons turned. Winter pressed down with its relentless cold, freezing even the breath of those who dared wander too far from the fire. Spring broke the land open again, revealing new shoots of grass and the promise of fresh beginnings. Through these cycles, Temüjin grew not only in size, but in resolve. His gaze, once filled with the innocence of childhood, now carried a clarity shaped by hardship. He understood what it meant to lose everything. And more importantly, he understood what it meant to rebuild. Despite the isolation of his youth, Temüjin was not cut off from the currents of the wider steppe. Travelers passed. In the far distance, traders wandering, holy men, scouts seeking pasture, young warriors testing their skill. Each encounter reminded him that his family's exile was not the whole of the world. Somewhere beyond these grasses, alliances formed, clans rose and fell. Ambitions sharpened in men who sought greater power and unity. The steppe was vast, but destiny was not always as distant as the horizon suggested. In these quiet years, the foundations of his character settled like stone beneath the shifting soil: endurance, adaptability, a loyalty forged in hardship, and an ambition born from the certainty that he would never again allow others to dictate his fate. The boy who walked alone among shadows was becoming something more, a presence shaped by both loss and possibility. And somewhere, deep within him, a faint ember glowed. It did not yet have a name, nor form, nor direction. But with each passing season, the ember strengthened, awaiting the breath of opportunity that would ignite it into a force capable of reshaping the world. As the boy grew, so too did the world around him expand in both danger and opportunity. Temüjin no longer moved, only in the narrow arc of his family's survival. He began to venture farther, learning to read the subtleties of the steppe, which clans could be allies, which might betray without hesitation, which routes allowed quick travel, and which hid ambushes beneath gentle slopes. Every journey, every encounter became a lesson in trust and foresight. Friendship on the steppe was rare and earned. Temüjin discovered early that alliances were as vital as weaponry. Loyalty was measured not in words, but in deeds. A companion who stood by him through a freezing night or guided him across treacherous rivers was more valuable than 100 untested warriors. Through these relationships, he began to assemble the foundations of something larger than a family. A network of warriors, scouts, and advisors, bound by mutual respect and shared ambition. Yet the land was unforgiving. Raids could erupt without warning. Disputes over pasture or livestock escalated into bloodshed. Every alliance was tentative, every victory fragile. Temüjin learned to balance caution with decisiveness. Hesitation could mean death. Rashness could destroy the trust he had painstakingly earned. He observed, he measured, and he struck only when the consequences were calculated, precise, and unavoidable. By the time he reached early manhood, Temüjin had begun to command a small following. They were not yet an army, nor even a clan in the full sense, but they trusted him in ways that others had not. They recognized the clarity of his vision, the steadiness of his resolve, and the fairness he displayed to those who served him well. He did not demand loyalty blindly. He demonstrated it, earning obedience through example rather than fear alone. The steppe taught him another truth. Survival required both adaptability and ruthlessness. To ignore the customs of rival clans or the realities of the land was to invite disaster. Temujin moved quickly to consolidate power where others hesitated. He offered protection to those who sought it, forged pacts with neighbors who respected skill over blood, and executed strategy with a precision that belied his youth. Small victories accumulated into influence and influence into reputation. Across the plains, whispers began to circulate stories of a leader rising from the margins, unafraid, unbending, and capable of commanding loyalty few men could inspire. Betrayal remained constant. Old friends turned on each other seeking advantage or revenge. Temujin faced these betrayals not with panic, but with measured retaliation. Each act of treachery became an opportunity to refine his understanding of power. He learned how to turn enemies into instruments of diplomacy, how to neutralize threats without squandering manpower, and how to act decisively when subtlety failed. These lessons, carved into experience by necessity, prepared him for a destiny few could foresee. The boy who had once been abandoned now walked the plains with a growing band of warriors who revered him. He moved among them as both guide and equal, participating in hunts, overseeing strategy, and ensuring the welfare of his followers. Leadership was not a mantle he claimed lightly. It was a daily exercise in judgment, endurance, and foresight. His decisions carried weight not only in immediate outcomes, but in the loyalty and morale of those around him. A misstep could fracture the bonds he had painstakingly forged. By forging these alliances, Temujin began to see the wider steppe as a realm that could be unified. He observed the chaos of divided clans, the petty feuds, and the shifting loyalties that left even the strongest families vulnerable. He understood that a single, disciplined force bound by loyalty rather than fear could outmatch many scattered adversaries. The vision of a unified people, a single power carved from the multitude of clans, was taking shape in his mind, though it remained unspoken, untested, and dangerous to pursue openly. The boy had also learned the subtleties of negotiation. A glance, a gesture, a promise, each carried significance, for words alone were insufficient. Respect was currency. Reputation was armor. Even minor acts of generosity could cement allegiance, while a single betrayal could ripple across miles of grassland, destabilizing everything. Temujin moved with awareness of these invisible threads, weaving a network of connections that strengthened his position while preserving flexibility. Strength, he realized, was useless if it could not be extended through others. Even as power grew, so did the tests. Winter storms claimed animals. Fevers struck unprotected families. Rival clans launched attacks without warning. Temujin faced each challenge with the methodical calm of one who had been forged by adversity since infancy. His followers observed him in moments of peril, crossing icy rivers, defending a family from raiders, or negotiating with hostile clans, and saw not a boy, but a leader who remained unshaken. Every trial reinforced their trust and further bound them to him. The land, once indifferent, became an extension of his strategy. Temujin moved like the wind he had always known, knowing the rhythm of rivers, the patterns of herds, and the hidden corridors through mountains. The steppe itself seemed to conspire with him, rewarding the careful observer and punishing the reckless. In this environment, strategy was not abstract. It was lived and breathed, a constant dialogue between mind, body, and terrain. By the end of these formative years, Temujin's reputation had spread across the steppe. Even distant clans spoke of him as a man of vision and resolve, one whose strength lay not only in personal skill, but in his ability to forge alliances, inspire loyalty, and act decisively. He had moved beyond survival into influence. He was no longer a boy abandoned. He was a leader in the making, a figure who would one day unite a fractured land under a single purpose. And as he looked across the endless grasslands where the horizon merged seamlessly with sky, he understood something that would guide his every decision. The steppe was a crucible, harsh but true. It revealed the weak and strengthened the determined. It rewarded patience, cunning, and courage. In its winds and storms, in its solitude and danger, Temüjin found not fear, but clarity. The man who would become Genghis Khan was beginning to take shape, forged by the very land that had once threatened to break him. The sun sank low, behind distant ridges, casting long shadows that stretched across the grass. Fires burned in scattered gurs, illuminating faces that had come to trust this rising leader. And beneath the vast sky, the young warrior contemplated the possibilities of a world that had never seen his kind of power, where unity could overcome chaos, where ambition could reshape the fate of nations, and where one man guided by vision and necessity could rise from exile to command the destiny of continents. The steppe had always tested its children, but now it demanded more. Survival alone was no longer sufficient. Power required mastery. Temüjin had seen the scattered clans, the disjointed warriors, and understood that unity, discipline, and strategy could turn fleeting influence into unstoppable force. From the dust of the plains, he began shaping something unprecedented, an army forged not by numbers alone, but by speed, cohesion, and unwavering obedience. Central to this transformation was the horse. On the steppe, a warrior without his mount was nothing more than a shadow. Horses were bred to endure cold and hunger, to carry men and their weapons across vast distances without faltering. Their hooves struck the grass with a rhythm that mirrored the heartbeat of the land itself. Temüjin recognized that these animals, trained to respond instinctively, could become extensions of his own will. Every maneuver depended upon their trust. Every raid was choreographed through their motion. The horse was both vessel and weapon companion and shield. From dawn to dusk, training was relentless. Young riders were tested over frozen rivers, steep ridges, and miles of rolling steppe. Bowstrings sang with tension. Arrows traced precise arcs aimed from the saddle at targets that swayed with wind and motion. Warriors learned to maintain balance, to fire without hesitation, to read the subtle shifts in both terrain and enemy formation. The smallest lapse could cost lives. The most meticulous practice could save them. The steppe, indifferent as ever, allowed only those who adapted to thrive. But it was not skill alone that distinguished these men. Discipline became the backbone of the force. Camps were organized with meticulous order. Scouts reported positions, conditions, and threats with exacting precision. Riders drilled in formations designed for mobility and flexibility, learning to scatter and converge on command. Signal flags and smoke were studied as if they were extensions of speech itself, conveying information across miles of open grass. Every element of the army operated as a single organism, each member aware of both their role and the broader plan. Hierarchy, too, was enforced with clarity. Temujin appointed leaders based on merit rather than birth, elevating men who demonstrated courage, intelligence, and loyalty. The old ways of privilege mattered little here. Survival and victory demanded competence above all. Each leader oversaw a small unit, a decimal structure of tens, hundreds, and thousands, ensuring both cohesion and flexibility. Orders traveled swiftly, and accountability was absolute. The chain of command, once fluid and chaotic in other tribes, became as rigid as the wind against a cliff. Logistics, often overlooked by outsiders, became a strategic advantage. Horses carried not only warriors, but supplies carefully rationed and distributed to allow prolonged campaigns across vast distances. Cooks, blacksmiths, and medics' roles, once deemed secondary, were integrated seamlessly into operations. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a purpose. Water sources were mapped. Grass availability was calculated. Even the placement of temporary gurs in the field followed a plan to optimize security, accessibility, and the endurance of the men and animals alike. The Mongol army, though mobile and lean, moved with the precision of a machine designed for survival and destruction. Training extended beyond combat. Warriors learned to read weather, to anticipate the movements of rivals, to use the land's subtle signals as guides. A cloud's formation, a river's rise, a distant column of smoke all carried potential for strategy. Each rider developed the capacity to act independently, yet within the larger rhythm of the army. Autonomy and obedience existed together, an unusual balance forged through discipline and mutual understanding. These lessons could not be taught with lectures. They required immersion in the land-repeated trial and hard-earned experience. Strategy was the natural culmination of this preparation. Temujin observed neighboring tribes, noting their strengths and weaknesses. He studied methods of surprise encirclement, feigned retreat, and rapid redeployment. He integrated knowledge from scouts and captured advisors, adapting foreign techniques into the fluid style of the steppe. He understood the importance of timing, of exploiting terrain, of concentrating force at the decisive moment. Battles would be waged not only with arrows and lances, but with calculation psychology and the exploitation of fear. A disciplined, swift, and intelligent army could dismantle even the most formidable fortifications of the settled world. And yet, for all its rigor, the Mongol army retained the essence of the steppe. It was built on freedom within structure instinct, guided by training and loyalty, earned through respect. Every man knew the consequences of failure, yet every man also knew the value of initiative. The combination of relentless preparation, unity of purpose, and the unyielding bond between horse and rider created an entity that was more than human. It was a force of nature made flesh. In these early stages, the army was still small, a fraction of what it would become. But each raid, each campaign, reinforced the system. Units practiced dispersal and convergence, feigned routes to lure enemies, and tested communication across the plains. Observers, both allies and rivals, began to notice the precision, speed, and adaptability of these warriors. Where other groups relied on brute numbers or static defenses, Temujin's men relied on preparation, foresight, and the natural advantages of their environment. Morale and loyalty were maintained through a code that combined justice and reward. Acts of bravery, skill, or initiative were recognized immediately. Betrayal or negligence was punished swiftly, establishing clarity without ambiguity. These rules, clear and enforced consistently, created trust among the troops. Men knew what to expect, and that certainty became a weapon in itself. Warriors could act boldly because they understood the consequences of both action and inaction, and they respected the authority that had proven itself fair and effective. By the end of this period, the foundations of an unparalleled military force were laid. Horses, men, and strategy had fused into a system capable of rapid, decisive action across the steppe. The army's reputation began to spread, carried on wind and word across grasslands that had previously known only fragmented power. Rivals and allies alike began to see that a new force was rising, one disciplined, agile, and lethal, forged from the very land that had honed its people for generations. The Mongol army, still in its infancy, was already more than an army. It was an extension of the steppe itself, swift, relentless, and inexorably precise. And as the sun set over the rolling grass, casting shadows that stretched like long fingers across the land, the first sparks of campaigns that would reshape continents were taking hold, hidden in the dust, kicked up by hooves, and the quiet resolve of men who had learned that survival demanded mastery, and mastery demanded unity. By the time the young commander's army matured, it had become more than a collection of riders and horses. It was a living instrument, calibrated to strike with precision across vast distances. The Mongols had learned that victory did not come from numbers alone, nor from the strength of fortifications, nor from the pride of ancestral arms. Victory came from movement coordination and the unerring application of skill honed in the harshest environment imaginable. Scouting parties moved ahead like shadows, silent and observant, noting every bend of the river, every low ridge that could conceal an enemy, every pattern in the sky, signaling wind, rain, or snow. Reports traveled swiftly, carried by riders who could traverse more than 100 miles in a single day. The army became a web of observation, each unit an eye or ear feeding information back to the command with accuracy that stunned even the most experienced rivals. Knowledge of terrain, weather, and the disposition of foes became as lethal a weapon as any sword or arrow. Formation and discipline were paramount. The army operated in units of 10, 100, 1,000 each, with distinct roles yet capable of seamless integration. When confronting larger forces, smaller groups could disperse, feigning retreat to draw enemies into traps. Then, at the precise moment, these same groups converged like waves, cutting off escape routes, surrounding the unwary, and delivering concentrated strikes at the most vulnerable points. Flexibility and cohesion existed together, making the army simultaneously elusive and omnipresent across the plains. Communication, critical to this precision, relied on innovation and clarity. Smoke signals and banners conveyed orders across miles of open terrain. Couriers carried more detailed instructions, their speed ensured by fresh mounts and well-planned relay points. Even the terrain itself became part of the system. Elevated ridges offered vantage points. Rivers provided natural lines of movement, or obstacles for enemy pursuit, and forests, where present became traps, or screens for ambush. Every inch of the steppe was mapped and manipulated. Logistics, often overlooked in history, were another cornerstone. Supply lines were simple but effective, built to maximize speed and endurance. Horses carried food, water, and weapons in measured quantities. Camps were temporary and mobile, dismantled as quickly as they were established, leaving no trace for pursuers. Even fatigue was managed with rotation. Exhausted riders switched with fresh mounts, ensuring the army's momentum never faltered. In this system, movement itself became an offensive tool. No terrain was too distant, no enemy too entrenched to evade or surprise. Training extended beyond the bow and lance. Warriors practiced synchronized attacks, feigned retreats, and rapid redeployment, mastering the combination of individual skill and collective action. A single rider could act independently, exploiting a weakness or delivering a decisive strike while still operating within the larger tactical framework. The army was not just coordinated, it was anticipatory. Every engagement became an interplay of prediction, reaction, and timing. Even morale was engineered as carefully as strategy. Soldiers were rewarded for courage, initiative, and loyalty. Punishments were swift but consistent, establishing clarity and reinforcing obedience. Men knew their place, yet understood that merit could elevate them, ensuring motivation aligned with collective goals. Trust in leadership, forged through both fairness and demonstration of skill, became a force multiplier, enabling units to act with confidence even when cut off from direct orders. Temujin also grasped the psychological dimension of warfare. The Mongol army cultivated a reputation that preceded it, exploiting fear as an element of strategy. Rapid raids, sudden appearances, and relentless pursuit created an aura of inevitability. Enemies unfamiliar with the army's methods often surrendered or fled even before arrows could be loosed or swords raised. The steppe's openness amplified this effect. No hiding place, no retreat was secure from a foe who moved like the wind and struck like thunder. Tactics were refined through constant practice and engagement. Early skirmishes were not merely tests of strength, but laboratories of strategy. Retreats were studied and repeated until they became instruments of deception. Encirclements were rehearsed until each rider knew exactly where to ride to cut off an enemy's path. Cavalry charges were timed to exploit terrain, weather, and enemy formation. The army's movements resembled a choreography of destruction, fluid and adaptable, with every participant aware of both their immediate role and the broader objective. Adaptation was vital. The Mongols learned to incorporate techniques from other cultures encountered on the steppe and in battle. Siege engines borrowed from engineers of Central Asia, reconnaissance methods observed in neighboring tribes, and tactical innovations from settled kingdoms were absorbed, refined, and deployed with the unique mobility of the Mongol horse. The army became a living synthesis, combining the harsh discipline of the steppe with knowledge scavenged across hundreds of miles of open land. By the end of these formative campaigns, the army had become an entity unlike any before it. Commanders trusted each other. Warriors trusted their mounts, and each component of the system understood its purpose. A single unit moving in isolation could hold its own against larger forces. Combined, the army moved like a shadow across the steppe, omnipresent, unstoppable, and invisible until it struck. It was not merely an army, it was a force of nature born of land hardship and the relentless vision of its leader. The Mongols had learned that preparation, observation, discipline, and psychological insight could outweigh raw numbers or fortifications. The steppe had forged them into masters of mobility and strategy. They could traverse 100 miles a day, engage an enemy on multiple fronts, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. Their arrows fell with deadly precision, their lances pierced with timing, and their coordination seemed to anticipate the very movements of those who opposed them. And yet, for all their prowess, the army remained a reflection of the land itself, open, expansive, and unpredictable. Just as the winds shifted without warning, just as rivers rose and fell, the army relied on continuous vigilance, constant adaptation, and the unspoken bond between horse and rider. Mastery was not static. It was earned daily in every exercise, every encounter, every mile crossed under sun, rain, or snow. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, illuminating the plains in muted gold, the young commander observed his men and their mounts. The army's heart beat in rhythm with the steppe, steady, relentless, and ready. What began as scattered clans, lost families, and exiled boys had become a force capable of challenging kingdoms. Each rider, each arrow, each coordinated movement was a promise of conquest, of change, and of a future that would reshape the world. And so as dusk settled and shadows stretched across the endless grass, the Mongol army, still only beginning to realize its potential, stood ready. The next campaigns would test it further. The innovations, discipline, and foresight that had taken years to perfect would soon meet the fortifications, armies, and civilizations of the settled world. And in those trials, the full scope of what the steppe had forged, the horses, the riders, the strategy, and the vision of a single, unyielding leader would finally be revealed to the world beyond its borders. The plains of northern China unfolded like a world apart from the rolling grasslands of Mongolia. Rivers carved valleys deeper than the steppe ever offered forests, and hills fragmented the horizon, and the cities rose like islands of stone in an ocean of cultivated fields. Here, life was measured not in the movement of herds or the drift of seasons, but in walls, gates, and the rigid order of government. It was a world built to resist, to contain, and to endure. Temujin's army, now seasoned and disciplined, approached these fortified lands with the knowledge that the rules were different. The cavalry that had dominated the open steppe could not rely solely on speed here. The men adapted swiftly, for the Mongol way was rooted in observation and flexibility. Scouts examined every river crossing, every walled city, and every slope that might hide a sentry. They studied the flow of trade along the Silk Road, noting which towns were vulnerable and which could resist for months. Every detail was cataloged, every opportunity weighed. The first encounters were warnings. Small garrisons and lightly defended towns fell with swift efficiency, often without prolonged battle. Archers fired from horseback volleys, raining into unprotected courtyards. Cavalry swept through open gates before reinforcements could mobilize. It was not cruelty that dictated these actions. It was necessity, a precise application of force designed to weaken morale, disrupt communication, and consolidate control. The Mongols understood that speed and surprise paired with disciplined strategy could unravel defenses before armies fully assembled. Larger cities posed different challenges. High walls, gates reinforced with iron, and moats demanded new tactics. Engineers, often drawn from conquered peoples or allied clans, devised machines capable of hurling stones, battering gates, and undermining walls. These devices, alien to most steppe warriors, became instruments of adaptation. Temujin observed their deployment closely, integrating lessons into the army's methodology. Every strike, every movement was a calculation how to maximize pressure while minimizing exposure, how to exploit weak points that the defenders themselves overlooked. Patience, too, became a weapon. Sieges stretched into days, then weeks. The Mongols learned to manipulate timing, supply, and perception. They cut off communication, diverted water, and harried foragers beyond the city walls. Each night, fires flickered on the surrounding hills, signals for distant units to prepare for sudden movement. The army became a rhythm of action and observation, testing endurance as much as strength. Slowly, the cities yielded not merely to arrows or stones, but to the weight of unrelenting, intelligent pressure. In these campaigns, the Mongols also refined their understanding of human behavior. They distinguished between defenders, willing to surrender, and those who would resist to the last. Diplomacy, often overlooked on the open steppe, became an extension of strategy. Envoys carried messages offering terms, promising leniency for compliance, and invoking fear for defiance. This blend of intimidation, negotiation, and precise force became a hallmark of their approach, amplifying the army's efficiency beyond the capabilities of raw numbers or brute strength. Beyond the gates, the cultivated lands of northern China presented new challenges. Irrigation networks, cultivated fields, and dense villages complicated rapid movement. Horses accustomed to open grasslands had to navigate narrow paths, rivers, and paddy fields. Supplies, once easily scavenged on the steppe, required careful planning. Temujin's commanders adapted quickly, ensuring that foraging and requisitioning did not cripple the army's mobility. The balance of speed and sustainability became a constant calculation, honed through trial and observation. The steppe-born archers, whose eyes had tracked prey across miles of open grass, now adjusted to rooftops, towers, and streets. Their aim, disciplined by years of practice, found new targets: defenders atop walls, militia moving through narrow streets, officers attempting to rally scattered soldiers. These engagements were not chaotic. Each movement, each arrow, each maneuver was part of a larger choreography. Coordination extended not only across the army, but across time, anticipating reactions, exploiting hesitation, and striking decisively when opportunity presented itself. And yet, for all its innovation, the army remained true to its roots. The mobility that had dominated the Mongolian plains did not vanish in the river valleys or against stone walls. Mounted units patrolled the periphery, ready to intercept reinforcements, harass foraging parties, and maintain the initiative. Cavalry operated in tandem with siege engines, ensuring that the momentum of the attack never faltered. What the city walls lacked in openness, they made up for in challenge, and the Mongols met it with the same precision, adaptability, and patience that had always defined them. In one campaign after another, cities of northern China fell, some surrendering after brief resistance. Others only after protracted sieges tested every skill the army had cultivated. The pattern became familiar: reconnaissance, strategic positioning, intimidation, concentrated attack, and swift adaptation to unexpected defenses. Each success reinforced the army's reputation and Temujin's authority, while each setback provided knowledge for the next engagement. Over time, a network of control emerged: fortified towns, captured engineers, and a growing sense that no city, however walled, could withstand the methodical advance of this disciplined force. Through these early campaigns, the Mongols also began to absorb knowledge from their adversaries. Engineers, tacticians, and laborers were incorporated into the army, transferring expertise in construction logistics and siegecraft. Weapons were adapted, techniques were refined. The army became not only a force of destruction, but also a learning machine, capable of evolving rapidly to meet challenges that the steppe alone could not have prepared it for. Mobility, intelligence, and adaptability combined to create an army unlike any other in history, one capable of reshaping continents. By the time Temujin's army pushed deep into northern China, the boundaries of the steppe's influence were already expanding. The open plains that had nurtured these riders were now giving way to river cities and cultivated land. Each conquest brought not only territory, but knowledge, resources, and manpower. Every city captured became a new node in a growing network of control, providing engineers, provisions, and intelligence for the campaigns yet to come. The Mongols were no longer simply survivors of the steppe. They were conquerors of worlds shaped by walls and order. And as the sun dipped behind the distant mountains, casting the first shadows over fields, towers, and riverbanks, the army paused only briefly. The next day would demand the same combination of observation, strategy, and relentless movement. The Mongols were learning to bend new lands to their methods, integrating the unfamiliar into their proven discipline. The fall of northern China was not merely an event. It was a demonstration of the synthesis of steppe-born skill innovation and the unyielding will of a leader who had never known the luxury of ease or mercy. The conquest of northern China was not merely a sequence of victories. It was a lesson in the art of adaptation, patience, and ruthless efficiency. The fortified cities of the Kim dynasty loomed like monuments to human ingenuity, their thick walls and watchtowers defying the open plains from which the Mongols had emerged. But the army that Temüjin had forged was no ordinary force. It was a living embodiment of steppe-born discipline and innovation, capable of turning even the most formidable barriers into gateways of opportunity. Early encounters revealed the limitations of direct assault. Massive stone walls could not be scaled by horsemen alone, and gates reinforced with iron defied battering rams. Siege towers, catapults, and other engines were constructed under the guidance of engineers captured or recruited from conquered territories. The Mongols learned to integrate these devices into a larger system, combining long-range bombardment with precise timing of cavalry maneuvers. No detail was too small. The placement of a siege tower, the angle of a catapult, the rotation of supply lines, all could tip the balance between swift victory and costly stalemate. Even more crucial was the understanding of logistics on a scale never demanded on the steppe. The army's needs multiplied as it moved deeper into settled lands. Grain water and fodder had to be calculated with precision, and depots were established to maintain a steady flow of resources. Cavalry units rotated to prevent exhaustion. Engineers and laborers were shielded to maintain productivity. Temüjin recognized that an army moving across cultivated land could not rely solely on foraging. Efficiency and planning were as decisive as bravery or skill. Every march, every siege was supported by a network designed to sustain momentum and avoid attrition. The fall of key Kim cities followed a pattern as methodical as it was relentless. Reconnaissance first revealed weaknesses in gates, towers, and walls. Scouts mapped every alley and courtyard, noting the positions of defenders and the locations of potential reinforcements. Envoys were sometimes sent to negotiate surrender, leveraging fear reputation and strategic calculation. Where resistance persisted, coordinated attacks commenced. Volleys of arrows rained from siege towers, while battering rams and tunneling teams struck at the foundations. Cavalry patrolled the surrounding countryside, preventing escape or reinforcement, ensuring that the defenders were isolated in both space and spirit. In each engagement, the Mongols adapted swiftly. Lessons from one siege informed the next, building a cumulative knowledge that spread across the army. Engineers borrowed techniques from neighboring regions. Siege tactics evolved rapidly. Horses accustomed to open plains were guided carefully through difficult terrain, their strength preserved for the decisive moments. Each city conquered was not only a strategic prize, but a training ground, further refining the army's capabilities and deepening the trust between leader and men. As northern China fell, the Mongols confronted the Tang dynasty, whose lands lay to the south, richer and more densely populated. Rivers widened marshes, complicated travel, and walls became even taller, fortified with multiple layers. The Tang had learned from earlier invasions. They understood the value of preparation and the limits of cavalry. Yet the Mongols were no longer the same force that had roamed the Mongolian steppe. They were adaptive, disciplined, and ruthless, an army that integrated mobility engineering and psychological pressure to achieve objectives that would have seemed impossible only a decade prior. Temujin observed and directed with meticulous care. Each decision accounted for terrain, climate, the morale of his troops, and the psychology of the defenders. Cavalry units were used to encircle, harry, and intimidate. Siege engines softened fortifications, and precise timing ensured that every action reinforced the next. These campaigns demanded more than courage. They required calculation, patience, and unwavering discipline. Victory became less a matter of brute strength and more the result of orchestration, a symphony of movement, timing, and force applied where it would have the greatest effect. In the process, the Mongols also leveraged the knowledge and resources of the conquered. Engineers, laborers, and local scouts became integral to operations, providing expertise in construction, artillery, and logistics. The army was no longer a purely steppe-born force. It had absorbed elements of settled civilization, integrating technology and intelligence into its pre-existing structure of mobility, discipline, and strategy. This synthesis created an entity capable of confronting even the most sophisticated defenses with precision and speed. Despite the scale and complexity of these campaigns, the army maintained its cohesion and morale. Reward and punishment were applied with consistency. Initiative was recognized and encouraged, yet disobedience met swift consequence. Soldiers trusted the leadership because it had proven itself fair and effective, and in turn, they became instruments of unparalleled efficiency. The Mongols moved as one, a unified organism capable of achieving objectives that would overwhelm any uncoordinated opposition. By the time the northern cities had fallen and the southern campaigns loomed, the Mongols had transformed not only themselves, but the nature of warfare. No fortress, however well constructed, could resist the combination of mobility, engineering, and disciplined coordination. No defensive strategy could outlast the relentless application of observation, adaptation, and psychological insight. What had begun as a nomadic army designed for survival now confronted civilization itself, bending it to the methods learned on windswept plains. As twilight settled over the river valleys and ancient walls, the soldiers rested only briefly. The world of cities, rivers, and cultivated fields was a challenge unlike any the steppe had offered, yet the army had proven itself equal to the task. The Mongols were no longer merely conquerors of steppe rivals. They were architects of a new order capable of reshaping lands and civilizations with a combination of skill, strategy, and unflinching resolve. Temujin stood atop a hill, overlooking a captured city, the lights of torches flickering across courtyards and streets. The walls that had seemed impregnable now lay in shadow beneath his gaze, and beyond them, the lands of the Tong beckoned rich, vast, and yet not untouchable. The lessons of the North, hard-won and precise, would guide the campaigns to come. And as the wind swept across the plains and valleys, it carried a single, undeniable truth. The Mongol army had learned to conquer, not just through strength, but through foresight, discipline, and the relentless will of a leader who would not be denied. Beyond the fertile lands of northern China, across deserts and mountains that shifted from the familiar rhythms of the steppe, lay a realm both rich and volatile. The Khwarezm Empire stretched from fertile oases to dusty plains, its cities gleaming with wealth accumulated from trade tribute and the passage of caravans along the Silk Road. Merchants moved like blood through its veins, connecting civilizations and carrying riches from one corner of the world to another. Among these, a caravan of Mongol merchants journeyed with goods and news alike, a fragile lifeline between Temujin's growing empire and distant lands. But in a city of Khwarezm, trust proved fleeting. The governor, suspicious and arrogant, seized the merchants and, despite envoys sent to negotiate, executed them. The act, brutal and unequivocal, traveled across the deserts with the speed of rumor reaching Temüjin and igniting a response that would eclipse anything the world had yet witnessed. The Mongols were no longer simply conquerors. They were stewards of vengeance, and this violation demanded reckoning. Temujin's resolve was immediate. He understood that mercy in this case would signal weakness, that hesitation would embolden other rulers to act with similar disregard. Strategy now intertwined with fury. The Mongol army, seasoned in the open steppe and hardened by campaigns across northern China, began to prepare for a campaign not merely of conquest, but of absolute retribution. Supplies were marshaled, scouts dispatched, and plans crafted with meticulous care. Every detail mattered. The deserts and cities of Khwarezm would test the army in ways the northern plains had not. The generals, Steppe and Subotai, were dispatched to survey the terrain, to chart passes, rivers, and oases that would sustain movement over distances that would break ordinary armies. They mapped the empire's arteries, noting cities, garrisons, and merchant routes. Each report fed into a larger strategy, ensuring that the Mongol army could move with the speed, precision, and adaptability that had become its hallmark. Even the desert's shifting sands became an ally in disguise, allowing for rapid, unexpected approaches that no static city could anticipate. Discipline and preparation defined the army's approach. Horses were conditioned for the rigors of sand and scarcity. Their hooves hardened, their stamina tested. Riders trained in long-range scouting, concealment, and the rapid deployment of forces. Every man carried not only weapons, but knowledge of routes, enemies, and the signals that could convey orders across miles of barren terrain. The army's cohesion was tested in practice runs across the steppe, rehearsing encirclements, feints, and lightning strikes that would soon become hallmarks of the Khwarezm campaign. Temujin understood the psychological dimension of vengeance as well. The Khwarezmian leaders had acted with hubris, believing their cities impregnable, their soldiers superior. The Mongols would demonstrate otherwise. News of their approach, whispers of their previous victories, and the relentless speed of their movement became a weapon in itself. Cities and garrisons faced a choice: comply and survive, resist, and invite annihilation. The army, disciplined and prepared, became an extension of that will, turning fear into a force multiplier that magnified both the efficiency and the terror of the campaign. This was a war of information as much as it was of arms. Scouts reported on markets, rivers, and roadways. Spies infiltrated towns, uncovering weaknesses, alliances, and political fractures. Each piece of intelligence was weighed carefully, incorporated into plans that allowed the Mongols to strike at the most opportune moment. The combination of speed, knowledge, and precision made the army unpredictable and inexorable. The deserts, once viewed as obstacles, now served as theaters for maneuvers that would catch the Khwarezmians unprepared. Morale among the Mongols remained high, fueled by a sense of justice and purpose. The soldiers, having followed Temüjin across plains and rivers, now understood that vengeance was more than personal. It was an affirmation of the law of the steppe. To allow injustice to go unpunished would undermine not only their leader's authority, but the very order that bound them together. Each rider carried this understanding as closely as their bow and sword, ensuring cohesion and focus in the campaigns to come. As the army moved closer to Khwarezm, the first cities fell without resistance, their rulers swayed by fear or pragmatism. The Mongols adapted their methods to local conditions, combining siegecraft with rapid cavalry raids to secure territory and supplies. Rivers became supply lines, oases became staging points, and every tactical decision was reinforced by observation and intelligence. The army was a machine in motion, each element supporting the others, each man and horse moving as though part of a single organism, guided by foresight and unyielding resolve. The deserts themselves were no longer empty expanses. They became a theater of mastery. The Mongols used the terrain to mask movements, conceal forces, and launch surprise attacks. Their reputation, now amplified across the lands, preceded them, sowing doubt among defenders and merchants alike. Even the harsh sun and shifting sands could not break their discipline. Instead, the army thrived in adversity, drawing strength from the same hardships that had forged them on the Mongolian steppe. By the time the first major Khwarezmian cities were approached, the Mongols had demonstrated both the inevitability of their advance and the sophistication of their methods. They were not merely raiders. They were an army capable of integrating mobility, intelligence engineering, and psychological warfare into a cohesive whole. Each victory reinforced both confidence and efficiency, ensuring that every subsequent engagement would build upon the lessons of the last. The stage was set for a campaign that would become legendary in its scope and relentless in its execution. And as the sun fell behind the horizon, casting the desert in a muted glow, Temujin surveyed the lands ahead. The merchants' deaths had sparked more than outrage. They had illuminated the path of destiny. The Mongol army, honed by years of discipline, mobility, and adaptability, now prepared to bring the wrath of the steppe into an empire that had believed itself untouchable. In the silence before battle, one thing was clear: vengeance, when wielded with intelligence and precision, could reshape the map of the world. The empire of Khwarezm sprawled like a jewel across deserts and river valleys, its cities glittering with the wealth of traders who carried silk spices and gold across the continent. But now, each city, each fortress, each governor trembled under the shadow of an approaching force whose reputation had become legend. Jebe and Subotai, the sharpest minds in Temujin's army, led reconnaissance and advance units moving with a precision that seemed impossible across miles of barren sand. Their presence alone, fleeting glimpses of mounted riders on distant ridges, struck fear into the hearts of those who had believed themselves untouchable. The Shah ruler of this realm fled before the inevitable. His armies were scattered, his cities under threat, yet he could not grasp the scope of what had been unleashed. Every decision he made, every step he took, was anticipated by scouts who moved faster than any conventional army. The Mongols became the desert itself, invisible until the moment of attack, striking with sudden ferocity and disappearing into the shifting sands before countermeasures could be organized. The land that had once seemed a barrier now served as their stage, amplifying speed, coordination, and fear. Entire cities fell in the wake of the Mongol advance. Gates breached by battering rams' walls, undermined by tunnels and towers, assaulted from multiple angles, collapsed under the relentless application of strategy honed over years on the steppe. Cavalry encircled and intercepted reinforcements, while mounted archers delivered volleys that prevented defenders from organizing. Within hours, urban centers that had prided themselves on wealth walls and martial tradition were transformed into ruins, their streets littered with debris, and silence, their populations decimated or fleeing in terror. Subotai and Jebe proved themselves masters of operational art. Their movements were choreographed across hundreds of miles, coordinating simultaneous attacks, feints, and encirclements that left the Shah scrambling and his generals paralyzed. Cavalry units conducted diversionary raids, drawing enemy forces away from strategic points, while siege engines struck with precision at key gates or towers. Desert and river alike became avenues of mobility rather than impediments, and the Mongol army operated with a unity and foresight that seemed to anticipate every counterattack before it could be mounted. The psychological impact was profound. Word of destruction preceded the army, and cities surrendered to avoid annihilation. Those who resisted were met with overwhelming force. Their resistance, once calculated as a show of strength, only hastened their downfall. Reports of devastation spread along trade routes, reinforcing both the terror and the inevitability of Mongol vengeance. Temujin's army, already feared for mobility and discipline, now wielded reputation as a weapon, amplifying its efficiency across lands unfamiliar with steppe warfare. Logistics and endurance became as critical as combat. Deserts demanded careful management of water, grain, and fodder. Horse rotations supplied depots, and scouting for resources ensured the army's momentum never faltered. Even the harshest conditions could not halt them. Scarcity and fatigue were managed with the same precision that directed arrows and lances. Soldiers were conditioned to endure the heat and thirst, their morale bolstered by the understanding that each victory, each city captured, was a step toward justice, revenge, and ultimate order. As the pursuit continued, Shah's movements became increasingly desperate. Cities he thought secure became traps. Towns he bypassed fell to raiders, operating with astonishing speed. The Mongols executed pincer movements, cutting off escape and striking in unison from multiple directions. No fortress could withstand both mobility and siege. The army applied pressure with methodical patience, a strategy designed to exhaust defenders physically, mentally, and strategically. Every engagement reinforced the inevitability of defeat. Subotai's genius in maneuver became evident in the timing and sequencing of attacks. Columns struck simultaneously from unexpected directions. Forces feigned retreat only to return with renewed force at critical moments. This continuous interplay of feint and assault speed and precision bewildered the Shah's generals, who had never faced such integrated, disciplined movement. The Mongols, once known as raiders of the steppe, were now tacticians of unparalleled sophistication, adapting steppe strategies to desert terrain and fortified cities alike. Each conquered city provided resources, intelligence, and manpower for the next advance. Engineers and artisans were pressed into service, strengthening siege capability and maintaining mobility across difficult terrain. Scouts maintained communication lines, ensuring that orders and information traveled faster than any conventional army could hope to achieve. The Mongol system was both organic and engineered a network in which each unit rider and horse played a role in a greater whole that functioned with lethal efficiency. The horror inflicted on those who resisted served a dual-purpose punishment and instruction. Survivors carried tales of destruction to other towns and cities, a living demonstration of what awaited defiance. The campaign was calculated not for indiscriminate cruelty alone, but for strategic terror, ensuring that resistance was minimized and compliance maximized. Fear became a tool wielded alongside arrows, lances, and siege engines, a weapon that amplified the army's reach and effectiveness without a single additional man or horse. By the time the pursuit reached the Shah's inner sanctum, the empire had been shattered. Its armies defeated cities, burned or captured, and trade routes disrupted. Khwarezm was a landscape of ruin and obedience. Temujin's vengeance had been executed with precision, discipline, and insight, reflecting the qualities that had forged the Mongol army from the plains into an unstoppable force. The Shah's flight, once a tactic to preserve power, had only hastened his isolation and the collapse of his dominion. And yet the campaign was more than mere revenge. It was a demonstration of the full capabilities of the Mongol army: mobility, strategy, adaptability, and psychological mastery, combined into an instrument of unparalleled power. What had begun with the death of merchants became a sweeping redefinition of warfare, a campaign that would echo across deserts, mountains, and rivers for generations. The deserts of Khwarezm, once barriers, had become the proving grounds of an army capable of reshaping the known world. As night fell over the ruined cities, the flicker of torches along the march routes traced the relentless advance of the Mongols. Dust rose in waves as riders patrolled the outskirts, ensuring no resistance remained. No message of defiance could survive. The Shah, once a proud ruler, had become a fugitive shadow, pursued relentlessly across lands he thought secure. The Mongol army, disciplined and adaptable, would allow no reprieve. Vengeance was a course set by fate and executed with unerring precision. And so, with the desert silent, but for the distant beat of hooves, the first phase of one of history's most fearsome campaigns concluded. The Khwarezmian cities lay shattered, their rulers humbled, and the Mongol army stood ready to continue its inexorable path. Every rider, every bow, every engineered siege reflected years of disciplined training and adaptation. The shadow of vengeance had stretched across the desert, and nothing in the Khwarezmian Empire, or any empire that would come to face them, would ever be the same. Beyond the deserts and ruins of Khwarezm, the Mongol army turned its gaze toward lands steeped in forests, mountains, and rivers unknown to steppe riders. The Caucasus rose ahead like a jagged barrier, snow-capped peaks slicing the sky, rivers carving valleys that shimmered in sunlight, and passes narrow enough to funnel even the smallest unit. For armies unaccustomed to such terrain movement would be perilous. For the Mongols, it was another challenge, a test of adaptability, skill, and foresight. Subotai, the master tactician, led this advance with calm precision. Scouts charted each ridge and ford, noting where ambushes might be set and which paths could sustain cavalry movement. Horses trained for endurance adjusted to rocky slopes, while riders learned to adapt their tactics to the confined and uneven terrain. Mobility remained central, but it had to be measured, calculated, and synchronized with the rhythms of the mountains themselves. Every day brought lessons in patience, observation, and the disciplined application of force. Georgia was the first land to meet the Mongol tide. Its fortresses, perched atop cliffs or guarding river valleys, presented new obstacles. Yet the army had learned from every siege, every city, every gate breached in Khwarezm and northern China. Arrows rained from horseback into courtyards and battlements. Engineers deployed ramps and siege engines to hurl stones into towers. Cavalry circled behind hills, cutting off reinforcements, preventing retreat, and ensuring that the defenders understood the inevitability of their defeat. The result was swift, methodical, and devastating. From Georgia, the Mongols swept into Armenia. Villages and cities alike fell often before resistance could solidify. News of the Mongol approach traveled faster than armies could muster. Fear became a force multiplier, the psychological edge honed to perfection on the plains and deserts now operating across forests and mountains. Subotai's advance units moved like shadows, invisible until the moment of attack, striking swiftly, then disappearing into valleys or over ridges, leaving panic and chaos in their wake. The army now approached the Rus, lands, a territory foreign in climate, customs, and warfare. Rivers meandered, wide forests blocked sight lines, and cities were fortified in ways unfamiliar to steppe-born riders. Yet the principles that had guided the Mongols across deserts and plains remained unchanged: reconnaissance, mobility, coordination, and psychological mastery. Scouts moved ahead to map rivers and garrisons. Messengers carried instructions along hidden paths. Cavalry units were poised to exploit every opening with precision and speed. Encounters with Rus forces revealed the stark difference between conventional armies and Mongol ingenuity. Russian troops often relied on heavy infantry and defensive positioning, hoping to blunt the shock of cavalry. The Mongols adapted, using feigned retreats, flanking maneuvers, and sudden concentrated strikes to unravel these formations. Mobility, once a simple advantage on open grasslands, became a carefully measured instrument, exploiting terrain while minimizing exposure. Every engagement was a lesson in timing, coordination, and anticipation. Subotai's genius shone in the orchestration of multiple columns moving across difficult terrain. One detachment might engage a city, drawing defenders' attention, while another struck deep into their rear. Communication, maintained by relays of horsemen, ensured that forces converged at decisive points with unerring precision. Rivers and forests, which might hinder lesser armies, became part of a larger strategy, channeled and exploited for maximum effect. The Mongols had become masters not only of combat, but of operational art on a continental scale. The psychological impact on Rus cities and towns was immediate. Word of the Mongol advance, of cities already destroyed and of armies defeated, spread ahead of the riders. Panic erupted. Some cities surrendered without a fight, others tried to resist, only to find their plans anticipated and undermined. The Mongol reputation built over years of conquest now served as an invisible weapon, eroding morale before swords were even drawn. The inevitability of their approach reshaped decisions, often determining the outcome before battle began. Along rivers and hills, the Mongols deployed the tactics that had become their signature encirclements: feigned retreats, sudden charges. Cavalry units acted in concert with intelligence gathered from local informants, mapping defensive positions and predicting troop movements. Artillery and small siege engines, though adapted to the constraints of the terrain, softened fortifications and cleared paths for cavalry breakthroughs. Every engagement was conducted with a precision that made the army seem everywhere at once, moving like a storm across the land. By the time the Mongols approached the Kalka River, their path of conquest stretched across mountains, deserts, and forests, leaving fear and ruin in its wake. The forces of Rus had gathered, attempting to stem the tide, yet they were confronted not merely by numbers, but by the full integration of reconnaissance mobility and coordinated force that the Mongols had perfected over decades. Each maneuver was calculated, each decision informed by intelligence and the lessons of campaigns across continents. And as the sun set over the hills and rivers, the Mongols paused only briefly, assessing the terrain and the disposition of forces before the inevitable clash. Horses pawed at the earth, nostrils, flaring eyes bright with anticipation. Riders adjusted bows and checked lances. The army, honed by hardship and tempered by previous campaigns, awaited the moment when the battle would unfold. Across the Caucasus, through valleys and forests, the shadow of the Mongol advance stretched forward, unstoppable, patient, and deadly. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the skill and discipline of the Mongol army, but also the resilience and strategy of the Rus. Every victory in Georgia and Armenia, every lesson from desert and steppe, now coalesced into a force poised to strike with decisive power. The Mongols had become more than an army. They were a phenomenon, a calculated storm that would sweep across unfamiliar lands and confront civilizations that had yet to understand the nature of the force moving toward them. The first engagement at Kalka loomed a test of coordination, intelligence, and adaptability. The Mongols, disciplined and precise, would demonstrate that strategy, patience, and foresight could overcome the largest and most well-organized forces. As the moon rose over the hills, the army's shadow stretched across the riverbanks, a silent promise of the storm that would come with the dawn. Every rider, every arrow, every maneuver was part of an unfolding design that had been honed for years across deserts, plains, and mountains, a design that now reached the edge of Europe itself. The Kalka River stretched like a silver ribbon across the plains, flanked by low hills and scattered forests. For the Rus princes and their assembled armies, the river was meant to serve as a natural bulwark, a line behind which they could marshal forces and stand against the feared Mongol tide. Soldiers lined the banks, banners snapping in the wind, confident that numbers, armor, and the terrain would secure victory. They did not yet know the full measure of the storm approaching. From the distant hills, the first Mongol scouts appeared, their riders moving with the silent precision of shadows. They circled, reconnoitered, and retreated, probing the defenses, testing reactions, and sending messages back to Subotai and Jebi. The Mongols did not charge blindly. Each movement was deliberate, each action a calculated measure of the enemy's strength, discipline, and morale. The Rus forces observing from the riverbanks saw only fragments of this intelligence, unaware that it would determine the outcome of the battle before a single arrow was loosed. The first clash was subtle, almost imperceptible. Mongol cavalry struck at foragers and outlying posts, feints meant to draw attention to gauge response and to provoke overextension. The Rus armies advanced cautiously, unsure of the enemy's numbers, formation, or intent. Subotai's strategy was already in motion: encircle, isolate, and gradually erode both morale and position. Every engagement, even small skirmishes, was designed to reinforce the illusion of retreat and vulnerability, luring the Rus commanders into fatal misjudgment. As the main forces drew near, the Mongols executed the feigned retreat, a tactic perfected over decades. Cavalry units broke from engagement in apparent disorder, drawing Rus troops forward across the plain. The princes, misled by the apparent disarray, pressed hard, abandoning defensive caution in pursuit. Yet the Mongols' retreat was precise, disciplined, and designed to channel the enemy into prearranged positions. Hidden contingents waited in folds of terrain behind hills and along riverbanks, ready to strike with sudden concentration and lethal coordination. When the moment arrived, the Mongols struck as one. Arrows rained in simultaneous volleys from multiple directions, battering lines and sowing confusion. Cavalry circled behind, cutting off retreat and blocking reinforcement. The Rus infantry, heavily armored and slow, could not adapt to the fluidity, speed, and coordination of the Mongol maneuvers. Attempts to regroup or counterattack were anticipated, neutralized by scouts and reserve forces who executed flanking attacks with deadly timing. Chaos unfolded like a storm consuming the plain. The discipline of the Mongol army revealed itself in every maneuver. Feigned retreats drew opponents into traps. Reserve units struck from hills and forests. Light cavalry harassed flanks and rear positions, preventing any semblance of order. Communication flowed seamlessly, messages relayed by relays of horsemen, ensuring that Subotai and Jabi's commands were enacted with precision. The Rus commanders, though valiant, were unprepared for such orchestration, their forces fragmented by the very movements they had assumed to be Mongol confusion. Arrows and lances struck in waves, battering formations, while the small detachments scaled hills and ridges to rain arrows from elevated positions. The Mongol army moved as if it were a single organism, each part aware of the other, reacting, advancing, retreating, and striking with synchronicity. What appeared to be disorder to onlookers was actually a meticulously controlled sequence of maneuvers designed to maximize disruption and minimize risk to Mongol forces. The Rus forces, trapped and harried from all sides, began to crumble. As the battle intensified, panic spread. Soldiers separated from commanders' units lost cohesion, and the heavy cavalry could not reposition quickly enough to respond. Mongol horse archers exploited every opening, moving with fluidity across the battlefield, drawing enemy units into traps and striking with precision before vanishing. Each engagement was brief, decisive, and overwhelming, leaving survivors disoriented and exhausted. The Mongol method, mobility, coordination, psychological manipulation, had turned the Rus' strength into vulnerability. The culmination of the battle was swift. The Mongols executed encirclements that converged with precision, closing the Nu around remaining forces. Attempts to break out were anticipated, met with coordinated counterattacks. The battlefield, once a line of banners and ranks, became a panorama of collapse. Rus armies disintegrated, leadership captured or killed, and morale utterly shattered. The rivers and plains which the defenders had counted on for defense, now framed their defeat. The geography manipulated as part of the Mongol plan. In the aftermath, the Mongols did not linger unnecessarily. Subotai and Jebe ensured that the remnants of resistance were neutralized while preparing to advance further. The efficiency of their campaign meant that recovery or regrouping for the Rus forces was impossible. Messages of devastation spread to neighboring principalities, reinforcing fear and demonstrating the consequences of defiance. Victory had been achieved not only through force, but through strategy, discipline, and the orchestration of every element of army terrain and psychology. By nightfall, the plains along the Kalka River lay quiet, but for the occasional patrol of Mongol cavalry. Fires flickered across the countryside, signaling both conquest and warning. The battlefield itself became a testament to the mastery of Subotai and the Mongol command structure's speed, deception, coordination, and relentless pressure combined to overcome numbers, terrain, and armor. The Rus prince's defeat was absolute, a stark demonstration of the steppe army's adaptability and lethal efficiency when applied to unfamiliar lands. The Kalka River campaign marked a turning point. Europe had witnessed, for the first time, the full measure of Mongol strategy and discipline. Rivers, hills, forests, and open plains alike could not shield armies from a force that combined intelligence, mobility, and psychological mastery. The Mongols had proven that no terrain was insurmountable, no conventional strategy sufficient, and no population immune to the calculated terror and precision of their advance. The storm of the steppe had arrived, and it would not abate. As the moon rose over the battlefield, illuminating the devastation, Subotai surveyed the terrain with calm satisfaction. The army, organized and unbroken, remained ready for the next advance. Every rider, every horse, every arrow had played its part in a larger design that stretched across continents. The Mongols had transformed from raiders to strategists, from survivors of the steppe to masters of operational art. The Kalka River lay behind them, but its lessons and triumphs would shape campaigns yet to come, echoing across the lands of Europe in fear and awe. Beyond the Rus lands, the vast plains and rolling hills of Central Europe awaited a new theater for a storm, forged in the deserts, mountains, and rivers of Asia. Hungary and Poland, kingdoms of wealth, fortified towns, and proud warriors stood as obstacles in the path of an army that had never known defeat. Yet the Mongols did not hesitate. Every lesson from Khwarezm, Georgia, Armenia, and the Rus had been absorbed and refined. What moved now across forests and plains was a force as disciplined, precise, and unyielding as any the continent had seen. Subotai led the advance with the calm calculation of a master strategist. Reconnaissance units scouted river fords, forest edges, and mountain passes, mapping terrain and identifying defensive positions. Cavalry, light and swift, moved in silence under the cover of dawn, and dusk, testing garrisons and supply lines and relaying information to command. Every action was deliberate, a probe into the heart of the enemy, measuring strength, reaction, and morale. The Mongols approached not as a single wave, but as a network of forces converging with unerring precision. The first major engagement came near Liegnitz, where a coalition of Polish and Silesian knights had assembled to halt the advance. Heavy armor-mounted cavalry and disciplined infantry formed lines intended to break any oncoming charge. Yet the Mongols, masters of deception and maneuver executed a strategy both elegant and devastating. Feigned retreats drew knights away from their formations. Arrows rained from concealed positions, while hidden detachments struck flanks and rear. The battlefield became a trap, a landscape orchestrated to magnify the advantages of mobility, coordination, and psychological pressure. At Mohi, Hungary, the stakes grew even higher. King Belele IV marshaled a massive army, deploying it along the Sajo River, relying on natural barriers and river crossings to limit Mongol mobility. The army hoped to blunt the shock of steppe tactics to force a decisive engagement on terrain favorable to heavy cavalry and infantry. The Mongols, however, adapted swiftly. Scouts identified weak points in the river's defenses. Engineers devised bridges and crossing points, and coordinated cavalry units executed maneuvers designed to outflank, encircle, and destabilize the defenders. The combination of speed, flexibility, and psychological warfare became apparent in every engagement. The Mongols were not merely soldiers. They were observers, analysts, and technicians of battle. Arrows targeted commanders and signalers, spreading confusion. Coordinated charges exploited gaps in formation. Feints and false retreats drew the enemy into vulnerable positions. Rivers, forests, and hills, obstacles to conventional armies, were manipulated to enhance the Mongol advantage. By the time the Sajo River battle reached its peak, Hungarian forces were scattered, their discipline broken, and their defenses crumbled under a combination of fear fatigue and relentless pressure. Supply lines carefully planned and maintained ensured that momentum was never lost. Horses rotated to preserve endurance, carried riders across distances that would have exhausted ordinary armies. Food and water were rationed and distributed with precision. Engineers and laborers maintained roads, bridges, and makeshift encampments to keep the army moving. The Mongols' ability to integrate logistics into operational strategy distinguished them from every army Europe had previously encountered. Efficiency became as lethal as the arrow swords and lances that struck from multiple directions. Towns and fortresses, even those believed impregnable, fell in rapid succession. Gates were breached through coordinated assaults. Walls were undermined or softened with projectile bombardments. Defenders were harried from multiple angles. Panic spread quickly. Citizens fled or capitulated before the Mongols arrived, carrying word of devastation that further amplified fear. Each city captured reinforced both the reputation and the operational momentum of the army. By the time the forces reached the heart of Hungary and Poland, the path of conquest was a trail of terror, precision, and ruthlessness. The Mongols' use of feigned retreats and encirclement remained central to their success. Knights, heavy infantry, and local militias drawn into pursuit were isolated, surrounded, and destroyed systematically. Every maneuver demonstrated a keen understanding of psychology and battlefield dynamics to instill overconfidence, then to exploit it, to create apparent weaknesses, then to strike decisively. The combination of mobility, coordination, and observation had been perfected over decades of campaign, and it was now applied to lands and armies entirely foreign to the steppe-born soldiers. As night fell over the rolling hills of Central Europe, fires from captured settlements flickered across the horizon. The Mongol army paused only briefly to rest and consolidate their formations intact, their morale unbroken. The land bore the marks of a force that moved with intelligence, discipline, and unmatched foresight. Each rider, each horse, each arrow and lance was part of an orchestra that executed strategy on a continental scale. Europe had encountered the storm, and it had only begun. The Mongols understood that speed, precision, and adaptability were decisive. The European armies, accustomed to static defenses and frontal assaults, were unprepared for the fluidity of steppe warfare. Subotai and other commanders ensured that every movement was deliberate, every unit coordinated, every feigned retreat timed to perfection. The result was not only tactical victory, but strategic dominance, as the Mongols carved a path through Hungary and Poland that would resonate for generations in the memory of Christendom. By the time the army rested along the plains, the significance of their advance was clear. These were no mere raids. This was a demonstration of operational mastery, combining reconnaissance mobility, engineering, and psychological insight into a force capable of defeating Europe's best organized armies. Rivers, forests, and towns were manipulated as part of an overarching plan. Heavy cavalry, formidable in European eyes, found itself outmaneuvered at every turn. The Mongol army, once confined to the steppe, had brought the art of war to an entirely new scale. The storm over Christendom had begun, and Europe would feel its force in the days to come. Each engagement, from Liegnitz to Mohi, had demonstrated a simple yet terrifying truth: strategy, discipline, and foresight could overcome even the most heavily armed defenders. And as the moon rose above the fields, casting long shadows across abandoned villages and burning fortresses, the Mongols prepared to continue their inexorable march, an unstoppable force advancing across unfamiliar lands with the same efficiency and ruthlessness that had conquered deserts, mountains, and rivers. The devastation wrought upon Hungary and Poland spread like a shadow across the lands. Kingdoms that had relied upon rivers, forests, and fortified towns now faced a force that moved with relentless speed and precision, unhindered by the terrain that once protected armies. Hungarian forces, though brave and numerous, were disoriented by Mongol tactics. Feigned retreats, sudden encirclements, and coordinated cavalry strikes that shattered cohesion. Armies that had counted on heavy armor, dense formations, and static defense found themselves overrun, their strategies outmatched by a fluid, disciplined adversary. As villages burned and fields lay trampled, panic rippled through towns and fortresses alike. Nobles, knights, and citizens alike fled or attempted hurried defenses, yet the Mongols exploited every misstep. Subotai orchestrated movements with meticulous timing. One column feigned withdrawal to draw defenders into traps. Another struck from concealed positions, and small detachments struck at supply lines and communications. The result was a cascade of disintegration, each collapse amplifying the next. European armies had never faced an enemy who could manipulate fear as skillfully as weapons. In Poland, the city of Liegnitz became a focal point. Local and German mercenaries attempted to form a defense, but disunity and misunderstanding of Mongol tactics made resistance ineffective. Cavalry charges, which in Europe would have broken infantry, were countered with agility and ranged fire. Flanking maneuvers severed reinforcements. Feigned retreats drew knights into traps where they were isolated and destroyed. By the end of the day, the city lay in ruin, its defenders decimated, and the survivors carried stories of terror to neighboring lands, spreading fear before the Mongols had even arrived. The Hungarian plains offered a different challenge, yet one the Mongols met with adaptive brilliance. King Bela IV had attempted to unite forces along the Sajo River, relying on rivers and marshes to slow the Mongol advance. But the Mongols circumvented obstacles with bridge-building rapid cavalry movement and coordinated feints. Skirmishes escalated into full engagements that demonstrated both strategic depth and tactical flexibility. Hungarian formations, unaccustomed to enemies who struck from multiple directions, simultaneously collapsed under pressure. Commanders found their orders anticipated their troops misled their hope, evaporating under the combined weight of mobility and foresight. Throughout the campaign, communication and intelligence remained paramount. Mongol scouts moved ahead of the main columns mapping terrain, observing garrisons and transmitting reports back to Subotai and the commanders. Rivers, forests, and settlements became channels of information as much as obstacles, guiding the army's movements and shaping decisions with precision. This intelligence, combined with disciplined execution, ensured that the Mongol army remained always one step ahead, a shadow moving across the landscape that could strike anywhere and everywhere with equal efficacy. Despite the victories, Europe's rulers misjudged the enemy. Each army assumed that sheer numbers and fortifications would be enough, failing to comprehend the Mongol approach of integration, intelligence, mobility, psychological pressure, and coordination. Cities surrendered too late or resisted in isolation, falling to the disciplined cavalry that struck with unrelenting timing. Panic and rumor spread faster than armies could organize, eroding morale even before combat began. The Mongols' reputation, forged over campaigns in Asia and the Rus lands, now dominated the European imagination, a prelude to the devastation that followed. Yet, as the Mongols prepared for further conquest, the unexpected struck. News arrived of Ögedei Khan's death in Karakoram, the supreme leader whose command had guided campaigns across continents. Without hesitation, Temüjin's successors ordered a withdrawal from Central Europe. The sudden cessation of hostilities surprised both the conquered and the victorious. Armies that had expected continued advance were recalled. Cities spared further assault, their survival owed only to timing and circumstance. The Mongols' withdrawal was deliberate, orderly, and swift, reflecting their discipline, even in retreat, leaving behind a trail of destruction and uncertainty. The retreat itself was a calculated maneuver. Columns regrouped, supply lines reestablished, and scouting ensured that no pursuing force could harass the army. The Mongols left a Europe in shock, kingdoms bewildered, and armies diminished, yet intact enough to tell tales of what might have been. Hungary and Poland, though ravaged, were left with the memory of devastation and the recognition that the steppe storm had touched their lands. Fear of the Mongols persisted, a psychological legacy as potent as any physical conquest. Across the plains and forests, survivors recounted tales of the Mongols' tactics, feigned retreats that lured armies into traps, cavalry that struck with precision from multiple directions, engineers who built bridges in record time to cross obstacles, and relentless pursuit that left no gap unexploited. These stories spread through courts and villages alike, embedding the Mongol campaigns into the consciousness of Christendom. Even kings and nobles, who had survived by circumstance, understood that they had faced a phenomenon, a force that defied conventional warfare. In Hungary, the aftermath was visible in every ruined village, every burned field, every collapsed fortress. The Mongol army, though no longer present, had reshaped the military and political landscape. Commanders analyzed failures, reassessed defensive strategies, and contemplated alliances in ways previously unnecessary. Europe had encountered the Mongol methodology firsthand, the combination of intelligence, mobility, coordination, and psychological manipulation had produced an effect far beyond the reach of mere numbers or heavy armor. By the time the army crossed back toward the Carpathians and the steppes, the impression left behind was indelible. Tales of rapid movement, strategic foresight, and tactical ingenuity spread like wildfire, shaping perceptions of the Mongols as invincible, omnipresent, and unstoppable. The sudden withdrawal, dictated by events in distant Karakoram, magnified both fear and respect. Europe, though, spared further immediate destruction, was forever altered. Military doctrine, city planning, and the consciousness of rulers all absorbed the lessons of the Mongol advance. And as night fell over the shattered landscapes of Hungary and Poland, Subotai and his generals surveyed the results with calm satisfaction. The army had executed its operations flawlessly. Rapid conquest, psychological dominance, and controlled withdrawal. The lands of Central Europe had witnessed, perhaps for the first time, the precision of Mongol warfare applied in a new continent. Every maneuver, every feigned retreat, every coordination of columns had demonstrated a sophistication unmatched in Europe. The storm over Christendom had arrived, and though it had paused, its legacy would endure, shaping the continent for generations to come. The vast plains of Mongolia, once the crucible of a single unifying force, now hummed with the complex rhythms of governance and expansion. The death of Temüjin the Great Khan marked not the end of conquest, but the beginning of a new phase, one in which the empire he had forged would be divided yet maintained through the delicate balance of loyalty, ambition, and ruthless efficiency. 4 khanates emerged from the remnants of conquest, each under the leadership of trusted sons and generals, each tasked with preserving authority while extending influence over lands as diverse as deserts, forests, rivers, and mountains. The Golden Horde stretched across the western steppes, encompassing the vast expanse of the Rus and beyond, a territory where cavalry could once again roam freely, and where the lessons of Kalka River and Eastern Europe would guide campaigns, tribute, and diplomacy. Commanders within this horde understood the delicate balance between extraction and rebellion. Cities were not merely plundered, but incorporated their resources channeled to sustain both armies and administration. Governance became a new battlefield where obedience, tribute, and strategic marriages reinforced authority alongside mounted warriors. To the south and southwest, the Ilkhanate took shape across Persia, Mesopotamia, and parts of the Middle East. These lands were rich in culture, commerce, and architecture, yet prone to fragmentation. Mongol rulers applied the same principles that had driven conquest intelligence networks, rapid communication, and strict discipline. Cities were monitored, trade routes protected, and dissent punished with precision. Persian engineers, artisans, and scholars were pressed into service to fortify the empire's reach, while generals maintained mobility and readiness to counter internal or external threats. Here, as in the western steppes, the shadow of the Mongols stretched far and wide. The Chagatai Khanate occupied the heart of Central Asia, encompassing deserts and oases that had once tested the endurance of riders and horses alike. This central region became the backbone of logistics, communication, and mobility for the empire, a bridge between the east and west. Caravans moved along routes once traveled by traders and explorers, now under the watchful eyes of Mongol authorities. The Khanate functioned not merely as territory, but as a conduit linking the distant corners of the empire with intelligence, resources, and armies poised to respond to threats on any frontier. In the east, the Yuan dynasty would eventually solidify control over China. But already, the Eastern Khanate began to integrate conquered lands, adapting administrative structures to manage vast populations while maintaining military readiness. Cities were garrisoned, trade flourished under protection, and knowledge, technology, and culture flowed along routes previously disrupted by conquest. Rivers, mountains, and fertile plains were harnessed to supply armies, maintain stability, and reinforce the reach of Mongol authority. The empire, once unified under a single leader, now functioned as a network of disciplined, coordinated, yet semi-autonomous regions. Across these Khanate trade and communication became arteries sustaining both power and wealth. Letters carried by mounted couriers traveled thousands of miles in days, connecting leaders, governors, and generals. Goods moved along protected routes, silk, spices, metals, and artisans traveling under the careful watch of Mongol patrols. This network was unprecedented in scale, linking the Pacific to the Black Sea, and fostering not only commerce, but the exchange of ideas, knowledge, and culture. The Mongols had become more than conquerors. They were facilitators of connectivity across continents. Diplomacy played as crucial a role as military might. Tribute alliances and negotiation balanced with enforcement and occasional displays of overwhelming force. Governors, military commanders, and merchants operated under codes designed to preserve loyalty while extracting maximum benefit. Cities and regions that had once resisted conquest were integrated through a combination of intimidation, incentives, and administrative oversight. Compliance was rewarded. Defiance was met with rapid, overwhelming retribution, ensuring the continued expansion and consolidation of the empire across diverse and often hostile territories. The Mongol army, now dispersed across 4 khanates, retained its hallmark discipline and adaptability. Units could be concentrated rapidly to respond to rebellion or external threat. Communication ensured cohesion, and intelligence networks prevented surprises. Cavalry remained central, but logistics, engineering, and reconnaissance had evolved to match the challenges of governing a continental empire. The mobility and precision that had enabled conquest were now applied to administration, patrols, and enforcement, demonstrating that strategic foresight could extend beyond battles into governance. Cities, once centers of trade, culture, and administration, became nodes in a vast imperial network. Caravanserais, garrisoned towns, and fortified outposts ensured safe passage for goods, messages, and armies alike. Scholars, artisans, and engineers contributed to both defense and prosperity. The Mongols, who had once relied solely on the simplicity of steppe logistics, now orchestrated complex supply lines, ensuring that distant khanates remained connected. Rivers, roads, and passes became conduits of imperial power, integrating territories that spanned thousands of miles. As the empire expanded, new challenges arose. Rebellion, famine, and natural barriers required constant attention. Generals and governors balanced authority with the necessity of adaptation, blending Mongol discipline with local knowledge and resources. Yet the core principles remained unchanged. Mobility, intelligence, coordination, and psychological dominance. These allowed the empire not only to survive, but to thrive, consolidating gains, extracting wealth, and projecting influence across regions that had once seemed impossible to govern from a single center. The Empire of Four Directions, though divided, reflected the genius of Temüjin's vision, a network of loyal subordinates, disciplined armies, and integrated intelligence extending across diverse landscapes and cultures. From the deserts of Central Asia to the forests of Eastern Europe, from the fertile valleys of China to the cities of Persia, the Mongols had created an empire that moved with speed, precision, and coordination unmatched in history. Each khanate, while autonomous, functioned as part of a larger whole, capable of rapid concentration, effective governance, and strategic projection of force. In this phase, conquest became consolidation. Territories were not simply claimed, but organized, integrated, and prepared for both trade and defense. Armies maintained readiness, while administrative networks ensured compliance. Merchants and envoys traversed the continents with unprecedented safety, bringing wealth and knowledge, while governors monitored both rebellion and resources. The Mongols had transformed from raiders of the steppe to architects of continental-scale power, proving that discipline, adaptability, and intelligence could shape not only battlefields, but entire civilizations. And as the sun set over the steppes and deserts, rivers and cities alike reflected the reach of the Mongols, the Empire of Four Directions stood as both a monument to conquest and a framework for administration, a living testament to strategy applied not only in war, but in governance. The vision of a unified and disciplined force had become reality, stitched together across landscapes as diverse as deserts, mountains, forests, and plains. What Temüjin had begun in the grasslands of Mongolia now endured on a scale that spanned continents, reshaping the world in ways both immediate and eternal. The sun rose over the vast stretches of the Mongol domains, casting light on deserts, forests, rivers, and cities that spanned thousands of miles. What had once been fragmented kingdoms, steppe tribes, and isolated settlements were now stitched together into a network unparalleled in history. The Empire of Four Directions, though divided among khans and generals, moved with a singular rhythm. Its arteries, composed of trade routes, mounted couriers, and disciplined armies, each reinforcing the other. Mobility and communication, once tools of conquest, now sustained peace and prosperity across continents. Trade flourished under Mongol protection, bringing goods, ideas, and people into contact as never before. Caravans laden with silk from the Far East, spices from India, and metals from Persia traversed routes secured by garrisons and patrols. Merchants moved freely along rivers, mountain passes, and open plains protected by the fearsome reputation of Mongol cavalry and the practical reality of rapid response. Cities like Samarkand, Karakoram, and Beijing became hubs of commerce, culture, and administration, connecting distant regions with a network of both wealth and information. The Pax Mongolica was not simply the absence of war, it was the enforcement of order across vast and diverse territories. Couriers traveled with mounted speed, carrying messages and intelligence that allowed khans to coordinate governance across deserts, rivers, and mountains. Tributes were collected, disputes mediated, and rebellions suppressed with precision. Local rulers, artisans, and traders understood that compliance ensured security, while defiance met swift and overwhelming consequence. Stability became a currency, and the Mongols had mastered its management. Cultural exchange, once incidental, now flowed deliberately along these arteries. Scholars traveled with caravans translating texts, exchanging ideas, and preserving knowledge from distant lands. Artisans introduced techniques learned in China to Persia, while Middle Eastern engineers contributed to fortifications and irrigation across Central Asia. Religious scholars moved along the same routes, spreading ideas of faith philosophy and law, creating a world where knowledge could travel as quickly as goods. The Mongols' conquerors, by origin, became enablers of a cosmopolitan exchange previously unimagined. The military, though still central to authority, took on new roles within this interconnected empire. Garrisons defended trade routes and cities, ensuring that wealth, people, and information flowed securely. Cavalry remained the instrument of power, capable of rapid deployment to quell uprisings or project force. Yet they now moved within a broader network of administrative oversight and logistical planning. Discipline coordination and intelligence became as vital to the empire's endurance as the swords and bows that had carved its borders. Rivers, bridges, and passes became lifelines maintained by engineers and monitored by patrols. The Mongols applied lessons learned from decades of conquest, supply chains, rapid communication, and the integration of intelligence allowed a single directive from a Khan to ripple across thousands of miles. Orders were executed with precision. Cities were supplied, armies reinforced, and merchants protected. The combination of mobility planning and oversight created a world where distant lands functioned as part of a cohesive whole despite linguistic, cultural, and geographic barriers. Economics and governance intertwined with military might. Tributes supported armies and administration. Trade generated revenue and ensured loyalty. Merchants, artisans, and local governors became partners in the maintenance of the empire. The Mongols, who had once relied on intimidation and conquest alone, now relied on integration, demonstrating a sophistication that extended beyond the battlefield. The empire's reach was measured not just by territory, but by the networks of trade communication and knowledge that spanned continents. Knowledge traveled along the same routes as silk and spices. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and cartography were shared between China, Persia, and the western steppes. Envoys and scholars carried ideas that would influence distant courts and universities for generations. The Mongols' ability to secure and facilitate this exchange transformed the empire into a conduit for civilization itself, connecting regions that had previously been isolated by geography, politics, or language. Information became as valuable as gold, and the steppe riders, who had once been feared for destruction, now ensured the flow of understanding. Even distant Europe felt the ripples of this connectivity. Though the Mongol withdrawal had spared much of the continent, trade and diplomatic missions carried knowledge of Asia, Persia, and the Rus lands westward. Maps improved, new techniques traveled, and goods from the east appeared in European markets. Fear remained, but so too did fascination. The Mongols had established a template for global connectivity, an early precursor to a world where distant continents were linked not merely by conquest, but by commerce, culture, and shared knowledge. The height of the empire demonstrated that conquest and integration could coexist. Cities once destroyed became centers of administration. Armies became instruments of stability, as well as force. Trade and knowledge were protected and encouraged. Culture flowed alongside gold and silk, creating a network that reinforced Mongol authority while enriching the world it touched. Across deserts, rivers, mountains, and plains, the Mongols had created a living system of governance and exchange, one that would outlast their own reign and shape centuries to come. As the sun set across the steppes, the rivers gleamed with reflected light. The cities hummed with activity, and the plains remained alive with cavalry ready to respond to threats. The empire of four directions, divided yet cohesive, had reached a level of power, connectivity, and sophistication previously unseen. From the deserts of Central Asia to the forests of Eastern Europe, from the fertile valleys of China to the cities of Persia, Mongol rule had transformed the world. The legacy of this era, the movement of people, goods, and ideas, would endure, leaving a footprint that time could not erase. Across the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire, from the arid deserts of Persia to the fertile plains of China, a new order emerged. Where once the steppe riders had swept through with fire and sword, now there flowed the rhythms of commerce, diplomacy, and knowledge. The same mounted couriers who had delivered battle orders and executed campaigns became the messengers of a fragile yet unprecedented peace. Pax Mongolica was not the absence of power, but the disciplined enforcement of it across thousands of miles, ensuring that the empire's arteries remained open and secure. Caravans of silk spices and precious metals moved under the vigilant protection of Mongol patrols. Desert and mountain passes, which had previously isolated regions and invited banditry, now became highways of safety. Merchant families traveling from Samarkand to Hangzhou knew that along the Mongol-controlled corridors, armed escorts could appear at any moment to ward off theft or ambush. The fear once inspired by the steppes warriors transformed into a reluctant respect for the law enforced by mobility intelligence and the omnipresent threat of swift retribution. Spires of cities rose as hubs of trade administration and scholarship. Karakoram. The empire's heart buzzed with envoys and scribes, artisans, and engineers, each contributing to a growing network of information and commerce. Letters traveled faster than armies ever could, with couriers switching horses at regular intervals, covering vast distances in days rather than weeks. The result was a world more connected than any previous civilization had achieved, where a message from the Chinese plains could arrive in Persia with remarkable speed and reliability. Along these arteries of power, knowledge and culture flowed as freely as gold and silk. Scholars moved between courts and cities, exchanging mathematical theories, astronomical charts, and medical texts. Religious ideas traveled in tandem, blending traditions and fostering understanding across cultures that had once been strangers. Artisans carried techniques across continents, influencing ceramics, textiles, and architecture from the Middle East to East Asia. The Mongols, whose origins were in conquest, had unwittingly become facilitators of a cultural and intellectual exchange unmatched in human history. Trade alone, however, was insufficient without enforcement. The Mongols maintained a network of garrisons and patrols along the Silk Roads and other key routes. Rivers, mountain passes, and deserts were regularly traversed to prevent rebellion or banditry. Fortified way stations offered rest supplies and communication relays. Couriers and messengers moving at breakneck speed ensured that the Khans were never out of touch with distant corners of their realm. The empire functioned as a living organism, each city, river, and road a vital part of its nervous system. Diplomacy, once the exclusive domain of kings and emperors, now extended across cultures, facilitated by the Mongols' order. Envoys traveled with unprecedented security, carrying not only messages of alliance or negotiation, but also the seeds of cultural understanding. European, Middle Eastern, and Asian courts exchanged gifts, knowledge, and strategic intelligence through this network, altering the perception of distant lands and creating a web of influence that transcended borders. Pax Mongolica became both a political strategy and a conduit for globalization centuries ahead of its time. The Mongols' disciplined enforcement of peace relied heavily on mobility. Cavalry units could traverse hundreds of miles in days, responding to rebellion or threats with precision. Rivers, bridges, and passes were kept clear. Maps and intelligence ensured rapid movement. Local governors coordinated with military commanders to maintain compliance and ensure resources were distributed efficiently. This integration of administration and military capability created a system in which the threat of force was constant but rarely needed because order itself had become an instrument of control. Cities along the trade routes flourished. Markets filled with foreign goods. Workshops produced artifacts blending multiple artistic traditions. Scholars exchanged texts and ideas. The Mongols understood that prosperity reinforced authority. Wealth, knowledge, and mobility became intertwined, each sustaining the other. Taxation and tribute were enforced efficiently, yet the protection of commerce allowed regions to prosper beyond what might have been expected under foreign rule. A merchant's coin, a scholar's manuscript, a diplomat's letter, all carried the imprint of Mongol organization and foresight. Knowledge dissemination transformed practical and intellectual life. Astronomy and mathematics from the Islamic world mingled with engineering from China. Medical texts traveled across the empire, influencing treatments from Persia to Mongolia. Religious scholars, including Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and Taoists, moved freely, exchanging ideas and interpretations. The empire's roads were not merely conduits of wealth, but channels of civilization, linking continents, peoples, and traditions in a network of unprecedented connectivity. The Mongols, once feared for destruction, now became guardians of human progress in a fragile, disciplined order. Even distant Europe felt the currents of this new pax. Though the armies had retreated decades earlier, reports of Mongol efficiency, protection of merchants, and facilitated knowledge reached courts and scholars alike. Maps improved astronomical knowledge traveled westward, and new goods enriched European markets. Fear and fascination intermingled. The Mongols had demonstrated a power capable of destruction, yet also of unprecedented connectivity and cultural exchange. Europe, even at its periphery, had begun to feel the reach of a continental-scale order unlike anything before. The empire's height lay in the combination of enforcement, communication, and facilitation. Traders, envoys, scholars, and armies operated within a framework that guaranteed safety and productivity. Rivers, passes, and deserts, once formidable barriers, became links in a chain spanning Asia and Europe. Every letter delivered, every caravan escorted, and every city monitored reinforced the network. The Mongols' legacy was not only military conquest, but the orchestration of a system that allowed people, goods, and ideas to traverse continents in ways previously impossible. As twilight descended over the empire, the deserts glimmered under the stars, rivers reflected fading sunlight, and caravan trails shimmered with the passage of goods and envoys. The steppe, once a crucible of Halm, now nurtured the rhythms of commerce and culture. Pax Mongolica was more than peace. It was a demonstration of organizational genius, a network that connected distant lands, ensured the flow of knowledge, and preserved stability across continents. In this era, the Mongols had become architects of order, guardians of trade, and facilitators of the exchange of ideas. As the Mongol Empire reached the apex of its power, the mechanisms of connection extended far beyond trade and diplomacy. Pax Mongolica was a living system, a network that allowed ideas, technologies, and cultural practices to traverse continents with an efficiency never before witnessed. Scholars moved alongside merchants, engineers collaborated across borders, and artisans carried their skills along the same roads once traveled only by armies. Knowledge flowed as freely as silk spices and gold, creating a web of intellectual and technological exchange spanning Asia and Europe. Caravans transported more than goods. They carried stories, maps, and treatises. Astronomical charts from Persia reached the courts of China. Chinese inventions from paper to gunpowder were introduced across Central Asia and into the Middle East. Medicine, mathematics, and engineering traveled the same routes, slowly altering practices and understanding in distant lands. Mongol oversight ensured that couriers, scholars, and merchants moved safely. The fearsome cavalry that had once crushed kingdoms now served as guardians of intellectual and cultural exchange. Cities along the Silk Roads became vibrant centers of learning and innovation. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar hosted scholars translating works from Arabic, Persian, Chinese, and Turkic languages. Libraries grew, filled with manuscripts that preserved knowledge previously lost to conquest or decay. Temples, mosques, and monasteries served not only as places of worship, but as centers for observation, recording, and teaching. Within the framework of Mongol administration, culture flourished alongside commerce, creating hubs that blended artistic, scientific, and philosophical traditions. The military, network though primarily designed for enforcement and rapid deployment, enabled these exchanges. Mounted couriers delivered critical information to khans, generals, and governors, ensuring centralized awareness across the empire. Engineers maintained bridges, roads, and river crossings, which became vital not only for armies but for caravans carrying merchants, scholars, and diplomats. The Mongols' mastery of mobility and logistics transformed isolated regions into connected nodes within an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea, from Siberia to the deserts of Persia. Religious and philosophical ideas spread with remarkable speed. Buddhist monks traveled westward, Muslims journeyed eastward, and Christian envoys passed between courts, creating networks of dialogue that crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries. Temples and mosques became centers for learning, translating, and recording texts that synthesized multiple traditions. The Mongols, while often indifferent to doctrinal matters themselves, facilitated these movements, understanding that knowledge, ideas, and cultural cohesion were tools as vital as military discipline in sustaining a continental empire. The protection of trade routes fostered not only commerce but urban development. Cities, previously vulnerable to raids, now prospered, under Mongol oversight, attracting merchants, craftsmen, and scholars. Markets expanded, workshops flourished, and artisans adapted techniques from foreign lands, blending styles in ceramics, textiles, architecture, and metallurgy. The empire had become a platform where innovation thrived alongside governance, turning once hostile regions into hubs of stability production and cross-cultural fertilization. Even distant European courts observed and absorbed the indirect benefits of Pax Mongolica. Knowledge of Asia and the Middle East filtered westward, influencing map-making, astronomy, and technology. Goods such as paper, silk, and spices reached markets that had rarely seen such variety, sparking fascination and new forms of commerce. Travelers, envoys, and merchants returning from the East brought stories of cities alive with scholarship markets teeming with goods and an administrative order, both alien and astonishing. Europe began to glimpse the interconnectedness of the world, a legacy imposed by conquest, but sustained by peace. Technology, too, moved along these corridors. Military innovations, agricultural techniques, and hydraulic engineering traveled from one region to another. Chinese siege technology informed Persian fortifications. Persian irrigation methods improved agriculture in Central Asia. Knowledge that once required years to spread now traveled in weeks or months, protected by the same forces that had once conquered kingdoms. The Mongols' insistence on disciplined communication and mobility enabled this flow, transforming the empire into a crucible for both innovation and preservation. The human aspect of this network was profound. Couriers and envoys traversed thousands of miles, connecting rulers, scholars, and merchants. Knowledge was encoded in letters, maps, and manuscripts, carried across deserts and mountains by men and women whose lives depended on speed, discipline, and awareness of danger. Each journey reinforced the Mongol order while transmitting culture, ideas, and commerce. Scholars exchanged techniques for navigation, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, creating a web of intellectual influence whose effects would echo for centuries. By integrating military, administrative, and cultural systems, the Mongols achieved a degree of cohesion unprecedented in history. Each khanate, though semi-autonomous, contributed to a larger framework where stability, commerce, and knowledge were mutually reinforcing. Rebellion was swiftly suppressed, trade was secured, and scholarship was protected. Rivers, deserts, and mountain passes no longer isolated communities. Instead, they became conduits of the Mongols' organizational genius. Pax Mongolica was both the product and instrument of an empire that had learned to govern as effectively as it had conquered. As the sun set over the steppes, the deserts, and the river valleys, the empire's vast reach became visible not only in maps, but in daily life. Merchants traveled safely where once only soldiers could move. Scholars studied texts that had crossed continents. Cities prospered under the stability of Mongol oversight. The cultural, economic, and intellectual exchange fostered by the Pax Mongolica would endure long after the armies returned to the steppe, leaving a legacy that bound East and West Central Asia and Europe in ways that reshaped the medieval world. The vastness of the Mongol Empire, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the fringes of Europe, had been its strength, and increasingly its vulnerability. The mechanisms that sustained Pax Mongolica discipline, communication, mobility, faced tests that no army or administrator could fully control. The unity forged under Temüjin began to fray as distance and ambition took their toll. Sons of the great Khan ruled vast khanates, yet each acted with a degree of independence that threatened cohesion. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface disputes over succession and tribute, creating fractures that would widen over decades. In the western steppes, the Golden Horde experienced tensions between regional governors and the central authority. Generals who had once served Temujin loyally now sought to expand their own influence, sometimes defying instructions from Karakorum. Cities and towns previously secured under Mongol protection occasionally rebelled, emboldened by the perception of divided leadership. Couriers and envoys traveled under constant vigilance, yet reports of dissent hinted at a shift in power dynamics. The aura of invincibility began to show cracks subtle at first, yet discernible to those who observed carefully. The Ilkhanate faced similar strains. Persia, rich in culture and resources, demanded attention and negotiation that could not always be reconciled with distant commands. Governors contended with local populations who were no longer cowed by conquest alone. Environmental pressures, including periodic droughts and food shortages, further challenged the empire's administrative networks. Tributes faltered, rebellions erupted, and the machinery that had sustained stability began to creak under its own weight. Mongol administrators realized that maintaining order across such diverse lands required more than fear and discipline. It required constant vigilance and adaptation. Across Central Asia, in the Chagatai Khanate, the deserts and mountains once dominated by steppe riders became sites of unrest. Nomadic tribes integrated into the empire through alliance or coercion, occasionally resisted tribute or encroachment. Trade routes suffered delays, garrisons faced unexpected skirmishes, and local governors struggled to maintain control. The same mobility and intelligence that had enabled conquest now had to contend with the unpredictability of human ambition and environmental challenges. Even the most disciplined armies could not entirely suppress the subtle pressures building within the Khanate. In the east, the Yuan dynasty faced challenges of administration over a vast and populous China. Integrating local bureaucracies and maintaining control over cities distant from the Mongol heartland required careful balancing. Corruption, mismanagement, and resistance from local elites created friction that slowed decision-making and weakened the perception of central authority. Rebellions, though, often swiftly crushed, hinted at the limits of Mongol governance. The dynasty's success in consolidation masked underlying tensions that would in time challenge the foundations of the empire. Disease, too, left its indelible mark. Epidemics traveled along the same routes that facilitated trade knowledge and cultural exchange. Populations weakened by illness were less able to support tribute or labor armies, struggled to maintain readiness, and urban centers faced the strain of public health crises previously unimagined. The Mongols, whose early conquests had been aided by the health and mobility of their forces, now had to contend with biological forces beyond their control. The empire's reach could not shield it from the vulnerability of human bodies to disease and the consequences for administration and stability. Rebellions erupted sporadically across the four khanates. Tribes, cities, and provinces seized opportunities when central authority appeared distracted or weakened. Each uprising, though often contained, demanded military attention, redirecting resources from trade and governance. Couriers carried urgent letters, generals marched swiftly, and governors enforced loyalty Yet each incident chipped away at the empire's cohesion. The perception of Mongol omnipotence, once so potent that it alone could deter resistance, now had to be reinforced continuously through action, not legend. Economic pressures amplified the cracks. Trade, which had flourished under protection, faced interruptions from rebellion, corruption, and logistical failures. Taxation sometimes fell short. Supply lines became strained and local economies strained under the demands of maintaining both prosperity and Mongol oversight. The empire's vast scale, once a source of dominance, became a structural challenge requiring constant coordination, adaptation, and enforcement. The systems that had made the Mongols effective conquerors now demanded even more skill to maintain peace and productivity. Yet the empire's decline was not sudden, but gradual, a slow unraveling that unfolded across decades. Some regions prospered under continued stability. Others struggled under mismanagement and rebellion. The very size and diversity of the empire meant that successes in one area often masked failures in another. Couriers traveled tirelessly, armies maintained vigilance, and governors executed orders with discipline, but the subtle erosion of centralized control persisted. Distance ambition disease and local dynamics began to define the limits of Mongol authority, revealing the inherent fragility of a continental empire held together by human coordination and fear. As the steppes cooled under autumn winds and rivers shimmered with early frost, the empire appeared outwardly unbroken, yet the foundations had shifted. Internal rivalries, environmental challenges, and the spread of disease had begun to undermine the cohesion that had made Pax Mongolica possible. The cracks in the empire were subtle at first, an unrepaid tribute here, a delayed courier there, but together they foretold a future of fragmentation. The legacy of conquest remained, but the permanence of rule was no longer guaranteed. The Mongol world, vast and magnificent, faced the inevitable consequences of overextension and human ambition. Even as rulers maneuvered to maintain control, the empire's enduring influence continued to shape the lands it once directly ruled. Knowledge, technology, and culture continued to flow along the networks established by Mongol authority. Cities remained connected, trade persisted, and ideas traveled across continents, leaving an indelible imprint on the civilizations touched by the steppe. Though cracks had appeared, the Mongols' achievements in administration, military strategy, and connectivity endured, influencing generations long after the authority of the Khans had waned. The Mongol Empire, vast and formidable, slowly yielded to the forces it could neither conquer nor command. The four khanates, once linked by loyalty and discipline, drifted toward autonomy, each responding to its local challenges. The Golden Horde faced the rise of the Rus princes, who reclaimed authority through negotiation, rebellion, and strategic alliances. The Ilkhanate in Persia contended with internal revolts, the complexities of city governance, and the pressures of sustaining armies far from the steppe. Chagatai leaders struggled to maintain control over the deserts and oases, while in the east, the Yuan dynasty confronted the challenges of governing the most populous empire in history. Distance, local ambition, and shifting allegiances rendered the once unified vision fragile. Natural forces compounded these human challenges. Epidemics and famine swept through the countryside, weakening both urban and rural populations. Diminished tax revenues strained the ability of governors to maintain garrisons, patrol routes, and trade networks. Harsh winters, shifting river courses, and arid summers tested the empire's logistical ingenuity. The systems that had enabled rapid conquest and efficient administration now had to respond to unpredictability on a scale as immense as the empire itself. Each disruption, though individually small, cumulatively eroded the cohesion that had made Mongol rule effective. Yet, amid these fractures, the Mongols left a legacy that transcended the decline of political power. Trade routes established under their protection continued to thrive, linking Asia and Europe with a continuity previously impossible. Merchants, couriers, and diplomats traveled with relative safety across lands once torn by conquest. Knowledge persisted. Manuscripts, astronomical charts, maps, and medical texts remained in circulation, carried along the very routes the Mongols had maintained. Artisans, craftsmen, and engineers continued to employ techniques disseminated across the empire, blending traditions from China, Persia, and Central Asia. The steppe warriors had unwittingly created a framework for long-term connectivity. Language, too, bore the imprint of Mongol governance. Administrative terms, military titles, and cultural phrases traversed the Khanates, leaving traces in Persian, Russian, Chinese, and Turkic dialects. The Mongol script used for official correspondence and record-keeping became a medium through which ideas were standardized and disseminated. Even after political authority waned, linguistic influences endured, embedding themselves within the fabric of local governance and communication. Across centuries, these subtle threads of language reflected the empire's vast reach and organizational sophistication. Military strategy, shaped by decades of Mongol conquest, left a lasting imprint on Eurasian warfare. Armies across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia studied the principles of mobility, intelligence, and disciplined coordination that had enabled steppe cavalry to dominate larger, slower forces. The concepts of rapid concentration, feigned retreat, and psychological manipulation became integrated into local doctrines, echoing the lessons of Kalka River Mohi and the campaigns in Persia. Even as the Khanates fragmented the art of war, bore the unmistakable influence of the Mongol legacy. Cultural and intellectual exchange persisted as well. Religious scholars, scientists, and artisans continued to traverse the Silk Roads, carrying ideas nurtured under Mongol oversight. Architecture, ceramics, textile patterns, and artistic motifs integrated influences from disparate regions, creating syncretic forms that reflected the empire's diversity. Universities and libraries preserved manuscripts, while oral traditions maintained stories of conquest, governance, and diplomacy. The Mongols' role as facilitators of exchange ensured that their presence continued to shape societies long after political control had diminished. Urban centers, once stabilized by Mongol administration, became permanent fixtures of regional life. Cities like Samarkand and Karakorum, once hubs of imperial communication, remained vibrant markets and centers of learning. Infrastructure roads, bridges, caravanserais, and fortified posts continued to support commerce, travel, and communication. The physical traces of Mongol governance endured in stone, wood, and earth, serving as reminders of both the empire's former might and the networks of stability it had created. Even in decline, the structural and logistical innovations of the Mongols influenced subsequent empires and polities. The Mongol Empire's story concluded not with sudden collapse, but with a gradual transition. Political authority fragmented, yet the mechanisms of control, communication, and cultural integration left lasting impressions. Trade routes remained active. Ideas continued to flow, and regional powers absorbed lessons of governance, logistics, and diplomacy. The memory of the Mongols' feared conquerors and skilled administrators persisted in chronicles, legends, and historical consciousness. Across continents, the echoes of their empire endured, shaping the evolution of states, economies, and societies long after the steppe riders had returned to their grasslands. In the West, Europe observed the distant echo of Mongol influence in diplomacy, cartography, and commerce. In the Middle East, Persian and Mesopotamian cities adapted Mongol administrative practices to their own governance. Central Asian khanates, while politically independent, maintained networks and practices inspired by steppe traditions. In the East, Chinese dynasties inherited administrative structures and trade protections that had been formalized under UN oversight. Across Eurasia, the world had been reshaped subtly yet irrevocably by the vision and discipline of a people who had once commanded the wind, the steppe, and the fear of continents. As the sun set over the deserts, rivers, forests, and plains of Eurasia, the Mongol Empire receded from direct power, but left a legacy, both tangible and invisible. Trade flowed along routes secured under Mongol oversight. Languages bore traces of administrative influence, and military doctrines incorporated lessons learned from the steppe. Scholars and artisans continued to move across regions connected by networks the Mongols had created. The empire's human and cultural imprint endured, a testament to the extraordinary reach of a civilization forged by survival ambition and unparalleled discipline. The story of the Mongols did not end with their political decline. It continued in the circulation of knowledge, the prosperity of trade, the diffusion of culture, and the evolution of governance. Their empire, once feared for destruction, had become a medium of connection, a framework for interaction, and a conduit of ideas across continents. The marks of their presence endured in ways more subtle, yet arguably more profound, than conquest alone could achieve. In this sense, the Mongols' shadow stretched far beyond the limits of the steppe, touching lives, shaping cities, and influencing civilizations for generations. And so the cycle of conquest, consolidation, and decline gave way to the enduring legacy of an empire that had changed the world. The steppe, the deserts, the rivers, and the mountains had witnessed the rise of a power unparalleled in scale, vision, and execution. Though fractured, the Mongols had left behind roads networks, cities knowledge, and strategies that would resonate for centuries. Their story was one of transformation of humanity, culture, and civilization itself, ensuring that the memory of the steppe warriors and their empire would endure long after their banners had fallen. The winds of the steppe still whisper across deserts, mountains, and rivers, carrying echoes of an empire that once stretched from the Pacific to the heart of Europe. The Mongols, born of hardship, hunger, and relentless ambition, had carved a world connected in ways never seen before. They conquered not only lands, but the imagination of countless generations, leaving behind roads, cities, languages, and ideas that would endure far beyond the rise and fall of their banners. History remembers them as warriors, administrators, and architects of connection, a civilization forged in the crucible of survival. yet capable of shaping the fate of continents. Even as the banners faded, their legacy persisted. Trade routes that had carried silk spices and gold continued to pulse with life. Scholars, artisans, and merchants traveled across territories once ruled by Mongol discipline, exchanging knowledge, art, and ideas. The steppe's children had become the stewards of connectivity, demonstrating that conquest could leave behind not only destruction, but lasting networks of civilization. Roads and caravanserais, bridges, and fortified posts all bore testament to the vision of a people who had mastered mobility, intelligence, and governance on an unprecedented scale. From the deserts of Persia to the forests of Eastern Europe, from the fertile valleys of China to the cities of Central Asia, the influence of the Mongols lingered in the rhythms of life, in the flow of knowledge, and in the strategies of war and governance. Their shadow reached far beyond the limits of territory, a reminder that the echoes of history extend long after the final battles are fought. Every city, every trade route, every manuscript carried traces of their empire, woven into the fabric of civilizations that would rise in the centuries to come. And so the story of the Mongols is not merely a tale of conquest, but a story of connection, resilience, and enduring influence. As we look back on the vastness of their world, it is impossible not to marvel at the scope of their vision, the discipline of their armies, and the networks they created that transformed the medieval world. If this journey through the steppe, the cities and the corridors of power, has captured your imagination, take a moment to join us in preserving history for the generations to come. Like, share, and subscribe to continue exploring the cinematic stories of empires that shaped the world. The echoes of the Mongols remind us history is alive, and every road, river, and desert carries the stories of those who came before.